Chapter 2344. For a time, the crowd's emotions were surging. Each and every one of them expressed that this choice was unacceptable. This choice could not be any worse. If they were to make such a choice, they might as well make the choice that the other camp had suggested. The Peak Quasi-Sage had clearly expected such an attitude from the crowd. He sneered and released his aura. The aura filled the entire hall and enveloped all the cultivators. With a single tremor, all the cultivators felt fear from the bottom of their hearts. All of a sudden, all the cultivators woke up from their dissatisfaction. They suddenly realized what kind of existence they had been questioning and why they had been courting death. Just now, in an instant, the entire hall fell silent. Even the sound of breathing had disappeared. "I'm not asking for your opinion right now. This is the final decision. If you're dissatisfied, you can challenge me. As long as you can win, I'll listen to you," the Peak Quasi-Sage said. Hearing this, all of the cultivators became dispirited. Although they had formed a complete organization for so many years and had cooperated with each other for so many times, there were so many arguments and compromises in the past, but there was still a gap between their strength. The difference in status brought about by the difference in strength was also irreparable. Under normal circumstances, when the Peak Quasi-Sage didn't show his strength, they could question and refute him at will. However, when the Peak Quasi-Sage displayed his strength and used it to oppress them, they could only listen to him obediently even if they were extremely dissatisfied. At this moment, the 3,000 cultivators didn't say a word and looked like they had turned into clay statues. Seeing how the crowd had turned out, the Peak Quasi-Sage knew that his violence had planted a hidden danger in the future. The peaceful and orderly atmosphere that he had deliberately created previously would no longer exist from now on. However, even though he knew this, he did not regret using force to suppress the differences between the two sides. After all, only when he had reached his current cultivation level did he realize the difference between him and Duan Shi. He also realized how insignificant his 3,000 cultivators were compared to Duan Shi. If they were to participate in the heavenly tribulation that Duan Shi and he had encountered, it would be like a group of ants participating in the battle between two huge dragons. If either of them paid attention to him, they would definitely die without a burial place. Not even a trace of them would be left behind. After understanding this, how could he participate in it? However, how could he explain these words to that cultivator? Could it be that what we're discussing now is nothing more than ants discussing which side to help when they see two dragons fighting? He was indeed happy to say this, but what about the morale of the cultivators? If he said that, the confidence of the 3,000 cultivators would be completely destroyed. As for the tribulation that would soon appear and spread throughout the entire world, the chances of them surviving it would be even slimmer. In contrast, using such a forceful method to suppress the differences between the cultivators might seem like a hidden danger. However, it could maintain their confidence and increase their chances of surviving the tribulation. It was precisely because of this consideration that he didn't regret his decision even though he knew that it would cause hidden dangers. While the 3,000 cultivators were arguing, there was a strange being that was eyeing the heavenly tribulation covetously somewhere in the world. It was an abyss. The abyss was located in the southwest of this world. In other words, it was in the southwest of the central continent, in the depths of the southern wilderness where there weren't many people. There weren't any traces of civilization within a range of billions of miles. There were only countless demonic beasts, divine beasts, and demonic beasts. There were also various cultivators who couldn't survive in the civilized areas of the central continent. In the depths of this barren land, there was an extremely deep abyss. It was said that this abyss led to the end of the world. Ever since it was discovered, no living beings that had entered it had ever come out. At this moment, there were thousands of strange living beings in the depths of the abyss. Those strange living beings seemed to be humans and beasts at the same time. They had all sorts of strange appearances, but they didn't seem to have a fixed pattern. Or rather, they didn't have a fixed template. These living beings with different appearances had one thing in common, and that was that their eyes contained an extremely stubborn aura of destruction. It was as if they were born for the sake of destruction, for the sake of destruction. Their ultimate goal, their greatest achievement, was to completely destroy everything. Those living beings were none other than the marks of the chaos creatures that had returned from reincarnation. At this moment, compared to the previous generation, these creatures were much more intelligent and much more restrained. In the past, these living beings would definitely start to destroy the surroundings as soon as they were born. In the end, they would be killed, imprisoned, and forced to submit until the tribulation arrived. There were simply too many of these living beings, and the other living beings couldn't resist them at all. Only when they could no longer resist would they gather together and start to destroy the foundation of this world. However, these living beings were clearly completely different now. They had even established an organization that was completely opposite to the 3,000 cultivators. And this abyss was their organization's headquarters. The thousands of living beings in the abyss were the organization's supreme leaders. This abyss was indeed like the legends said. It led straight to the end of the world. At the bottom of the abyss, there was a boundary between heaven and earth and the chaotic state of the outside world. It was like the place where Duanji was born and the place where the emperor received the information left behind by the true saint. The only difference was that due to the special structure of this abyss, traces of chaos aura constantly seeped out from below and filled the entire abyss. It constantly affected everything that entered the abyss, including living beings. When other living beings entered the abyss, they would naturally be affected by the endless chaos aura and be eroded. In the end, they would lose control of themselves and fall into the abyss's depths. They would enter the boundary between heaven and earth and chaos aura and eventually become a part of it, disappearing without a trace. That was the fundamental reason why the living beings that entered the abyss could not return to the outside. On the other hand, the living beings that carried the chaos aura were different. The brand they carried came from the primal chaos. This brand wasn't destroyed when they encountered the aura of the primal chaos. Instead, it started to absorb this information and make up for the damage the brand had suffered in the reincarnation of this world. In this way, not only would they not feel any danger or discomfort in the abyss, but they would also feel unprecedentedly safe and comfortable. After the imprints that came from the chaos aura absorbed the endless chaos aura, they naturally grew and began to strengthen continuously. As a result of this strengthening, the strength of these living beings would be greatly elevated. Of course, there were also some small side effects after absorbing the chaos aura. That was, the appearance of these living beings would change along with the changes. In fact, when these living beings reincarnated, most of them would actually become the appearance of the world's natural Tao bodies. In other words, they would have 3 eyes and 4 elbows. The reason why it had turned into such a strange state was because it had absorbed the endless chaotic aura. Here's our chance. Among the many living beings, a creature that looked like the fusion of a wild boar and a python spoke. That voice was extremely strange. It was deep and hoarse, and vaguely, there seemed to be countless strange noises contained in that voice. What chance? Another living being spoke not far away. It looked like a creature that was the fusion of a pheasant, a fish, and a lizard. It looked even uglier than the creature that was the fusion of a wild boar and a python. Its voice was also extremely unpleasant to the ears. Just hearing it was enough to make one's entire body numb, and all sorts of uncomfortable feelings arose spontaneously in one's heart. That person has clearly betrayed this world, which is why he was punished by the world. Perhaps we can pull him over and have him join our side. When that time comes, we won't have to worry about being sent into the reincarnation cycle again and again. The creature that spoke first was extremely pleased with itself. Upon hearing this, the other living being's eyes lit up. To creatures like them who already possessed intelligence and reason, they had already understood from the very beginning that their fates were actually to be sent into reincarnation time and time again by the world. In the end, they would be completely digested by the world and would only stop when they lost all of their sense of self. Under such circumstances, as intelligent creatures, how could they be willing to suffer such a fate? How could they watch helplessly as they were destroyed time and time again? Of course, they wanted to do everything they could to break free and obtain freedom. In fact, this organization was established because of this. However, even though this organization was established, they wanted to save as many of their companions as possible and give themselves a greater chance of survival. In fact, they knew very well that the possibility of them breaking free from fate and transcending the shackles was extremely small. In other words, it was almost impossible for them to succeed in their pursuit. What they were doing now was actually just a desperate struggle. In the end, it was hard to say how much effect they could achieve, how many benefits they could obtain, and how long they could live. At this moment, when the creatures heard this possibility, their eyes lit up. They looked at that creature as if they were looking at a god that had come to their rescue. Is that really possible? That person was the great emperor back then. Yes, he killed our main force, one of the creatures said. Upon hearing this, the creature that seemed to be a fusion of a wild boar and a python laughed. That's exactly why it's possible. As the ruler of the previous tribulations, he actually committed a crime against the heavens and was subjected to the tribulations by the world. This is clearly a sin that this world cannot make up for. In fact, compared to us, he might even be feared by this world. In that case, we're willing to accept him, and he should even be deeply grateful. How could he possibly refuse? Although these creatures looked extremely hideous, they were, after all, chaos creatures. Their imprints had been made up for and even strengthened. Therefore, they were much more knowledgeable about the reincarnation of living beings compared to ordinary creatures. Ordinary people could not tell what Duan Xing's past life was. Even if they could only make guesses about it. However, to them, the connection between Duan Xing and the great emperor was as obvious as reading a book on a palm. At a glance, they could see the similarities between their imprints. Under such circumstances, they naturally assumed that Duanshi and the great monarch were the same person. Then what are we waiting for? Let's move quickly. From the looks of it, he most likely won't make it. At this moment, another creature hurriedly cried out. He's not going to make it? How is he not going to make it? Another creature asked in confusion. Isn't that obvious? He might seem to have the upper hand now, but don't forget how we were like back then. Once you're targeted by this world, the stronger your performance, the stronger the attacks you'll face. Now that he's acting like this, it's obvious that this world is going to make its move soon. The creature that answered was extremely proud. Oh, I see. You're really wise. The doubtful creature came to a sudden realization. Hearing this, the creature from before was incredibly pleased. It continued, of course. I've died more than 10 times. I'm the most experienced one in this regard. The other living beings all looked at this being with admiration in their eyes, and this made him even more pleased with himself. No, let's wait a little longer. The imprints on our bodies are still too weak. We don't have as much power as we did in our past life. If we go like this, we won't be able to save him at all. Instead, we'll lose our lives, said the creature that seemed to have merged with a boar and a python. Judging from its reaction, it obviously did not think that there was anything wrong with what the other creatures said. On the contrary, it agreed with their judgment. It was just that its judgment of timing was slightly different from the other creatures. Chapter 23:45. The living beings with marks of chaos creatures were arguing noisily at this moment, and all of them seemed rather optimistic. They were optimistic about the prospect of Duanshi joining them. This alliance formed by living beings with marks of chaos creatures corresponded to the alliance formed by the 3,000 cultivators. For the alliance formed by the 3,000 cultivators, their goal was to help this world survive the repeated tribulations so that more living beings could survive each tribulation. However, for the alliance formed by the strange creatures in this abyss, their goal was to cause the greatest damage to this world during the repeated tribulations, and at the same time, to ensure that they could survive as much as possible. From a certain aspect, these living beings were already fundamentally different from the chaos creatures in the past. After all, for those chaos creatures, although the desire to survive as much as possible existed, they couldn't break through the influence of the impulse to destroy and couldn't change the way they destroyed everything. All of a sudden, one of the strange creatures said, "Perhaps we should shift our attention from that person to something else." This strange creature seemed to be half a bird and half an insect, and it wasn't the kind that was separated from the top and the bottom, but the kind that was separated from the left and the right. Even in this place where there were many strange creatures, this strange creature seemed to be particularly strange. At the very least, the other strange creatures around it seemed to look down on it and vaguely felt that they weren't the ugliest because it was at the bottom. What does that mean? Is there something more important now? The other creatures were bewildered and didn't know what this creature meant. After all, in their opinion, the addition of the Emperor could almost increase their chances of survival by more than 10 times. In comparison, was there anything else that could compare to this? Since there wasn't, what else could be more important than this? The half-bird, half-insect creature remained unmoved at this moment. It only said, "We come from chaos, but part of our nature has actually been assimilated by this world. In this way, we are actually somewhat similar to some living beings in this world. Haven't you noticed?" Upon hearing this, the other living beings looked at each other. In the end, a living being said, "You're talking about those living beings that were born at the border of the world? That's not all. There are also those who were sent into the cycle of reincarnation and reincarnated in the central continent, the living beings from the border of this world," the half-bird, half-insect creature said. "What are you trying to say?" one of the strange creatures asked in a displeased manner. Hearing this, the half-bird, half-insect creature sneered and said, "Don't you think that their similarities to us are a little strange?" "Wait, I kind of understand what you mean," the creature that looked like a fusion between a boar and a python said with a flash of inspiration. All of the other living beings couldn't help but cast their gazes toward this being from all directions. Compared to the half-bird, half-insect creature, this creature was clearly more recognized by the other creatures. They were more inclined to his judgment. This was the benefit of being active before. The half-bird, half-insect creature was quite displeased by this, but it did not say anything. After all, this wasn't something that could be changed by his attitude. "You're saying that they might be able to be strengthened here like us, change, and eventually become a part of us?" the creature that was a fusion between a boar and a python said. Upon hearing this, the half-bird, half-insect creature nodded and said, "That's right. They were born from the border of this world, and should have changed under the influence of chaos. To a certain extent, they could also be considered as chaos creatures. It's just that their portion that belongs to chaos is countless times less than ours." Good, good, good. We must pull them over. That's right. We must pull them over. Their numbers aren't any less than ours. If we can obtain their replenishment, our strength will increase by at least a few times. That's right. That's right. All of the living beings began to clamor incessantly, making the place appear to be in an uproar. This seemingly dark abyss actually seemed to be extraordinarily lively at this moment. At the same time, the aura of chaos released from the depths of the abyss below seemed to have strengthened a little. Even the chaos at the border seemed to be surging more intensely. At this moment, in an unknown distance away, Duan Shi, who was undergoing his heavenly tribulation, sensed that the heavenly tribulation seemed to have undergone some subtle changes. All of a sudden, the heavenly tribulation seemed to have broken its original stability. Instead, it began to gradually rise, gradually pushing its power to a higher level. What's going on? Facing this sudden change, he couldn't help but feel a little surprised. One must know that although the heavenly tribulation had lasted for a long time, the level of the heavenly tribulation had been maintained at a stable level since a certain period of time. This was also the reason why he was able to hold on even though he was in a sorry state. After that, he received pointers from his teacher and found a way to convert the power of the heavenly tribulation into his own strength. With that, it became easier for him to deal with the heavenly tribulation. Under the attacks of the heavenly tribulation, he even had the time to comprehend the various marks and wonders contained within. But now, he felt that the pressure from the heavenly tribulation was getting stronger. In a trance, he had a feeling that he was gradually being suppressed. Vaguely, there was an inexplicable frenzy coming from the heavenly tribulation. Of course, the frenzy wasn't strong. On the contrary, it was rather weak. If one wasn't careful, it would be overlooked. I must be mistaken. In the end, Duan sure wasn't as confident as Luo Fan. At this moment, he shook his head and tossed the ridiculous feeling out of his head. After all, the heavenly tribulation came from heaven and earth. If the heavenly tribulation transmitted a frenzy, didn't that mean that heaven and earth had become frenzied? But how was that possible? This was a perfect heaven and earth. A perfect existence that even gave birth to a true saint. How could such an existence become frenzied because of anything? If he felt that heaven and earth had become frenzied, then there must be something wrong with his senses. With that thought in mind, he tossed the feeling out of his head and focused on dealing with the waves of tribulations that were crashing down from above. At this moment, in the palace that existed between reality and illusion, Luo Fan wasn't as careless as Duan Shi. At this moment, his eyes flickered as though he could see through the endless distance and obstacles to see all the mysteries and secrets of the universe. There's actually such a change. It seems like this great tribulation's compliance with the rules is beyond my imagination. Such a thought flashed through his mind, and he looked a little excited. What kind of existence was he? Even if heaven and earth directly targeted him, he could still escape and hide in a place where heaven and earth couldn't do anything to him for so many years. It couldn't be any easier for him to deduce the reason behind some phenomena. Just now, when the heavenly tribulation that Duan Shi encountered slightly changed, he had already deduced the source of the change and deduced everything that was happening in the depths of the wildlands in the southwest. He also understood why heaven and earth had become frenzied because of that. The reason why heaven and earth left behind the imprints of the chaos creatures was to assimilate the imprints through the repeated tribulations, and in the end, turn everything from the chaos creatures into its own. In the end, it would strengthen itself and sublimate itself. Under such circumstances, the living beings formed from the imprints of the chaos creatures actually wanted to imprint the aura of chaos on the living beings that were already a part of heaven and earth and turn them into chaos creatures. This was simply equivalent to cutting out one's own flesh and feeding it to oneself. One could well imagine how unbearable this was for the world. It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that the emotions of heaven and earth were completely different from those of ordinary living beings, heaven and earth would have directly sent a shocking tribulation to completely wipe out all the living beings in the abyss. How could it only be a little frenzied? Through this change, Luo Fan also discovered something that he had already discovered before but didn't pay much attention to. That was, this great tribulation's compliance with the rules was far beyond his imagination. After all, although Luo Fan had stayed in this world for a long time and planned for a long time, he had never forgotten that he was currently in the midst of his sixth great tribulation. This world, the chaotic state outside heaven and earth, and even the traces left behind by the true saints, everything was merely created by this great tribulation. However, the existences that were created by this great tribulation were carrying out such an intense conflict according to their own characteristics and standpoints. The schemes between them had actually reached such a point where they would not stop until one of them died, and even gave Luo Fan so many opportunities to make use of them. One could imagine how strong the implementation of the rules was. But this is also normal, right? If I don't have such an opportunity, how can I have a chance to survive the absolute suppression of all the powers in the Great Tribulation? If that's really the case, then it's not a heavenly tribulation but a divine retribution. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he felt a lot more relaxed. He felt that the countless pressures that had been pressing down on his heart had suddenly relaxed a lot, and the slim chance of transcending had suddenly increased by who knew how many times. Since that's the case, I'll help you guys. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he casually pointed with his finger, and specks of spiritual light pierced through the barrier between the illusory and the real. They pierced through the boundless space-time and boundless obstructions, directly arriving in the abyss and entering the head of the creature that looked like a fusion between a wild boar and a python. As these spots of spiritual light fused into the head, the creature trembled slightly and suddenly felt that its mind had become much clearer. Countless inspirations appeared in its heart out of nowhere, making it feel as if everything before its eyes had suddenly become clear. Many of the problems that gave it headaches were solved at this moment, and they became extremely simple. It was as if he could see through everything at a glance and know all the causes and effects. So that's how it should be. So it's this simple. Why didn't I think of this before? It murmured, causing many creatures to cast strange gazes at it from all directions. After all, it was behaving too strangely at this moment. This narcissistic attitude was something that had never been seen in any living creature of their kind. In the face of such strange gazes, the creature that looked like the fusion of a wild boar and a python did not care at all. At this moment, it just constantly rethought its plan and carried out all sorts of complicated deductions. It didn't take long for it to recover from its shock, and it said, "I already know what I should do. All of you must firmly remember what I'm going to say next. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, then it won't just be the grand event that will be affected, even your lives will be lost because of it." This kind of attitude had never appeared before. In the past, although this creature was acknowledged by many other creatures, they only agreed with some of its views. At the end of the day, their statuses were still equal. At the very least, they were probably equal. However, this creature was clearly putting itself in an extremely high position. It was treating all of them as its subordinates, and all of them as targets that it could order around. How could other creatures get used to this? Normally, these creatures might have turned hostile because of this attitude, and they would have taught this boar and python creature a lesson. However, at this moment, they could faintly feel an indescribable pressure coming from this living being. They did not dare to speak or refute him. In fact, they even instinctively wanted to follow everything this living being said and instinctively submit to him. This feeling made all the living beings present feel rather uncomfortable. However, for some reason, none of them dared to voice out their discomfort. All of them actually agreed in a stern manner. When they agreed to it, they felt as if the uncomfortable feeling had been vented, and their bodies felt relaxed. Chapter 2346. Before these creatures could come to a conclusion, the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python had already issued an order. According to his arrangements, almost all of the living beings here had their own tasks to fulfill. Their mission was not to leave the abyss in such a violent manner and search for creatures born at the boundary of this world to join them. Instead, they would use various mysterious methods to activate a certain essence in themselves and use some mysterious channel to resonate with creatures that had the same characteristics as them. Then, all sorts of mysterious information would be transmitted to the hearts of those creatures through this resonance, causing them to draw closer to this place on their own. This method had completely subverted the limits of those creatures' imagination. After hearing this, they could not help but be dumbfounded. They looked at the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python with incomparable admiration. One must know that the method that they originally thought of was at most to use some method to hide themselves and leave the abyss to search for those creatures. That way, although they could achieve their goal, their safety could not be guaranteed. Not to mention anything else, they were definitely the enemies of all creatures in this world. With this identity, there was almost a 90% chance that they would come into conflict with other creatures. Not to mention the fact that they were faintly rejected by the world, which meant that their luck was extremely bad. As they walked in this world, they might encounter an accident every few steps. Although it wasn't fatal to them, it was definitely a huge problem. It was enough to make them have a hard time completing their mission. Perhaps a mission that could be completed in a few days might take a few months. Now, if they followed the words of the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python, they did not need to leave the abyss at all. They did not need to meet others, and they did not need to face the accidents that were watching them covetously all the time. They only needed to circulate their power here and activate their essence to complete their goal. It went without saying that the difficulty was much lower than they had imagined. How could they not be excited? How could they not worship the existence that found this method? Before, they still wanted to oppose this creature and maintain their dignity and status. Now, even the most stubborn creatures acknowledged the status of the creature that looked like a fusion of a boar and a python. They acknowledged that it had the right to command all of them. As these arrangements were carried out, the living beings began to take action one by one. In the blink of an eye, invisible ripples began to radiate from these creatures. They extended downwards and gradually fused with the chaotic aura. Then, through the chaotic aura, they reached the boundary between the world and the chaotic world. Using the various existences at the boundary as a medium, they began to spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, they had spread across the entire world. These fluctuations were extremely profound. Every single fluctuation contained the essence of a chaotic being, and all of them were extremely stubborn and strangely stable. Nothing could stop their transmission, and nothing could cause any damage to them. To ordinary objects, this kind of fluctuation had no sense of existence. However, to the living beings that were born at the border of the world, this fluctuation was like the light that they yearned for, the light that they were summoned by. It made them feel extremely comfortable and satisfied. All of a sudden, those creatures began to pursue these waves of energy on their own, trying their best to fuse these waves of energy into their own bodies, into the depths of their life source. As these changes occurred, the countless living beings that were scattered across the world began to riot. All sorts of terrifying power began to spread everywhere. Space and time were shattered piece by piece. These fluctuations continued to seep into the bodies of these living beings and fuse with their minds. They began to transmit all sorts of indescribable information to their hearts, making them suddenly understand many things that they had never understood before. So I'm different from them. As these thoughts appeared in the hearts of these living beings, the way they looked at other living beings began to change. An indescribably firm will began to change their mentality, causing them to involuntarily head southwest. They were heading toward the abyss in the depths of the wasteland. They already knew that only here was their source, and only here could they find their own kind. Only here could they find their future. These fluctuations were emitted by the living beings in the abyss, so they could naturally sense the feedback coming from all directions through these fluctuations. At this moment, when those living beings took action, they all sensed it through the fluctuations they emitted. At this moment, the abyss was filled with thunderous cheers. We finally succeeded. I didn't expect it to be so easy. I think you can be the Alliance Master, one of the living beings said to the boar python-like creature. Hearing this, the creature that seemed to be a fusion of boar and python did not look pleased at all. There was only a domineering air about it, as if it believed that no one else was qualified to be the leader of the alliance other than itself. The gazes of the other living beings changed. Some were in awe, some were in shock, some were dissatisfied, but most of them were in agreement. In an instant, the crowd's emotions surged. Each and every one of them agreed with the creature's words and pushed the creature, who was like a fusion between a wild boar and a python, to be the leader of the alliance. Although some of the other living beings opposed this decision, they were also interested in the position of alliance master. Perhaps it could be said that they were also interested in the position of alliance leader, but with the approval of the majority of the living beings, their objections were clearly ineffective. It didn't take long for an unprecedented leader to appear in the organization, someone who was acknowledged by all living beings. After the appearance of this alliance master, the unity of the entire alliance began to increase greatly. The entire alliance seemed to have grown from a pile of loose sand into a complete, inseparable entity. Only now do I feel like we have a chance at victory. A creature that appeared to be quite old said. Its words contained an indescribable emotion and joy, as if it had finally grasped a bit of light in the boundless darkness. Hearing this, the other living beings could not help but feel bewildered. What do you mean? Did we not have a chance at victory at all? After all, many living beings here felt that joining the alliance would bring them hope of victory, allowing them to survive in the battle against the world, which was why they had joined. Previously, they were extremely confident about this. They felt that even if the other living beings died, they would still be able to survive. They would still be able to recover their chaos creature imprints and become chaos creatures again. But now, hearing the old man's words, it seemed like they had no hope at all. Everything they felt before was just an illusion, so how could they not be shocked? Hearing this, the old man sneered and said, "Could it be that you have never thought about who our opponents are? It's just a world that was born not long ago. What's the big deal? Who knows how many worlds we've destroyed in the state of chaos?" One of the living beings said in disdain. "That's our predecessors, not us. Moreover, even our previous selves failed in the face of this world," the old man said. Hearing this, the scene fell silent. All the living beings stopped their disdain and clamor. They floated there in a daze and did not know what to do. They could use all sorts of opinions to cover up this fact before, but now that the old man reminded them, all their disguises disappeared. They finally realized what the truth was. They were merely living beings formed from the remnants of the chaos imprints left behind by the chaos creatures after their deaths. They did not have the power of the chaos creature imprints from before at all. To be able to retain even 1% or 1/1000% of its power was already a lot, and it was extremely unbelievable. Facing such a huge world, it went without saying what their chances of winning were. Not to mention that even their predecessors, the chaos creature imprints that were hundreds or even thousands of times stronger than them, had died before this world and were completely destroyed by it, leaving only their imprints. Under such circumstances, did they really have a chance of winning against this world? For a moment, an indescribable sense of panic appeared in their hearts. Even the little chance of winning that the old man had judged seemed to no longer be credible. Even if we unite, can we really win? Can we really survive the attack of this world? This was the thought that appeared in their minds. With this thought in mind, the scene became serious. All the living beings' gazes became erratic, and none of them dared to look at the old man. The old man sneered when he saw this and said, "What? Is everyone afraid now? Have you all lost confidence? Where did your arrogance go?" Upon hearing this, the many living beings fell silent. After a long while, one of them finally said, "Didn't you say it? Our current opponents are simply too powerful. Even if we unite, our strength hasn't increased by much. Could it be that we can really win against such powerful opponents?" Upon hearing this, although the other living beings did not speak, they all seemed to agree with this. The old man sneered and turned his gaze to the boar python-like living being that had also fallen into silence. Looking at its solemn gaze, he felt somewhat comforted. At the very least, This living being that was pushed to be the leader of the alliance did not lose confidence completely. If it lost confidence too, what awaited them would really be hopeless darkness. At that moment it said, "It's normal for all of you to have such thoughts. In fact, I'm even more delighted that all of you have such thoughts than before when you were full of confidence. What thoughts do you have? Hurry up and say it. Why are you keeping us in suspense now?" The boar python-like living being said. It had an impression of this old man. He was someone who had also survived the previous calamity like it. Moreover, the last time it saw it, it seemed to have lived for a very long time already. However, it had always been extremely low-key, as if it was an invisible creature and did not express its opinion on anything. In fact, it was quite surprised that it participated in the establishment of this alliance. For such a living being to express its opinion at a time like this was something worth paying attention to. The old man looked at the boar python-like living being and said plainly, "Of course I have some thoughts. In fact, if all of us unite, our strength will increase by more than 10,000 times." Upon hearing this, the many living beings could not help but gasp. 10,000 times? This multiple was not a simple number. None of the living beings dared to believe this multiple. "No way. How can it be 10,000 times?" One of the living beings retorted. "Whether it's possible or not, we'll know in the future. However, this multiple isn't the source of my information," the old man said. The other living beings were even more dumbfounded at this moment. Increasing one's strength by 10,000 times was already very exaggerated. Who would have thought that this wasn't the source of the old man's confidence? Could it be that there was something else that they had overlooked? "What do you mean by that?" The boar and python-fused creature couldn't remain calm and hurriedly asked. "What I mean is very simple, it's you," the old man said. All the other living beings couldn't help but turn their gazes to the Alliance Master from all directions. In other words, this creature that looked like a fusion between a wild boar and a python. At this moment, their gazes toward the Alliance Master became somewhat strange. There seemed to be some desire, some anticipation, some surprise, some doubt, and some shock. "There's nothing different." Finally, one of the living beings voiced out what all the living beings were thinking. The other living beings nodded involuntarily. In their eyes, the creature before them did not seem any different from before. Apart from the title of Alliance Master on its head, that was all. But that was all. Apart from this intangible difference, what else was there? At that moment, all the living beings couldn't help but wonder if the old man was trying to trick them or if he was trying to build up support for the Alliance Master. Chapter 23:47. While the other creatures made random guesses, the boar python creature was even more bewildered. "What on earth do you know?" it asked the old man coldly. The old man looked at the creature indifferently. His eyes seemed to be able to penetrate all barriers, all appearances, and directly see all the secrets hidden in the creature's body. Being stared at by such a gaze, even though this creature was a combination of a wild boar and a python, it couldn't help but feel strangely nervous, as if it was really hiding some secret. As soon as such a feeling appeared, it instantly shook its head and got rid of it, because it clearly remembered everything about itself. It did not have the secret that the other creatures thought it had. "Because you have the favor of a natural enemy," the old man said flatly. "Natural enemy? Ridiculous. What natural enemy do we have? If we have a natural enemy, why would it favor us since it is our natural enemy?" The other creatures were both shocked and angry. This was a matter of principle. The existence of a natural enemy was a matter of life and death for any kind of living creature. If such a creature did not know that it had a natural enemy, it would be even worse. Obviously, to those creatures, the old man's words meant that they had a natural enemy that they did not know about. This meant that they might have wandered around the gates of hell countless times. How could they not be shocked? At this time, the old man shook his head and said, "This natural enemy is not that natural enemy. This natural enemy is the enemy of heaven and earth, the enemy of the world. Hearing this, many living beings secretly heaved sighs of relief. At the same time, they looked at the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a boar and a python in astonishment. It was better if it had such a natural enemy. However, this also raised another question. When did this creature, which was a combination of a wild boar and a python, gain the favor of its natural enemy? Could it be that it had gained some benefits from that existence? For a moment, many people's eyes were filled with doubt. The boar-python creature was shocked and angry at this time. Why don't I know that I have gotten the favor of a natural enemy? If you don't tell me everything, today will be the day you die. The aura on his body surged, and a tremendous aura began to be released in all directions. The abyss seemed to have turned into a piece of paper under the impact of his aura, forming all sorts of indescribable distortions. The distortions continued to spread in all directions from where he was, causing all the living beings in the abyss to feel an indescribable pressure on their souls, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. It's so powerful? Such astonishment emerged in the hearts of many creatures. It had to be known that although the wild boar and python's fusion was somewhat outstanding, it was more in terms of intelligence. In terms of strength, it didn't have much of an astonishing performance. However, at this moment, when this creature unleashed its power without restraint, they came to a sudden realization. It turned out that this creature had been restraining itself all along. It turned out that the gap between them was actually so huge. For a moment, many creatures could not help but tremble. At this time, the old man was not affected by the momentum at all. He quietly hovered there, and his body seemed to have completely integrated into the abyss. No matter how the momentum washed over him, there was no change in him at all. Aren't you surprised? Why did you suddenly become so clear-headed and understand so many things that you did not know before? The old man said flatly. Following this, the boar-python creature shuddered. It instinctively wanted to deny it, but it suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of awkwardness in its heart. The old man's words also unknowingly seeped into its heart, gradually evoking all kinds of strangeness that it had involuntarily ignored before. Indeed, its previous performance was indeed a little exaggerated. With its original ability and intelligence, it seemed almost impossible for it to think of all that before. However, in reality, it had indeed thought of all this before. It had indeed thought of the safest, most convenient, and fastest method to summon the creature that was born at the border of heaven and earth. And when it recalled this, under normal circumstances, even if it had thought of this idea, it would probably have needed thousands or even tens of thousands of years to be able to perfect this idea and create the required method. However, just now, with just a thought, the entire process was directly skipped. This situation was strange no matter how one looked at it, and there seemed to be a secret no matter how one looked at it. With this thought, the terrifying momentum that was continuously released from its body began to gradually withdraw. The various changes in the abyss also gradually disappeared, and all the strange scenes completely returned to normal. Could it be that this is the so-called method of the so-called natural enemy? It murmured. That's right, only a great existence that can go against heaven and earth can use a method that none of us understand to make you understand these things. As the old man spoke, his eyes became slightly fanatical. It looked at the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python, as if it could directly see an incomparably huge and incomparably majestic figure hidden behind it. All sorts of thoughts flashed through the mind of the creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python. Countless flashes of light flashed through its mind, and the light of wisdom was continuously stimulated as it tried its best to deduce and search according to the old man's thoughts. In the end, it had to admit that perhaps the possibility that the old man had mentioned was the only possibility that could have led to this result. After understanding this, it could not help but smile bitterly. I originally thought that my potential was stimulated, But I didn't expect the truth to be like this. It was like a person who originally thought that he had become the richest person in the world with his own strength, only to find out in the end that the money that made him the richest person in the world was actually transferred to him by his own family using a secret method. It was self-evident how much of a blow that was. In this way, when he looked at his previous self that was full of confidence, he would definitely feel that he was no different from a clown back then. At this time, the many creatures finally reacted. Perhaps things were a little different from what they had previously thought. Perhaps there really was a so-called natural enemy. For a moment, they were both horrified and delighted. They were horrified that such a great enemy actually existed in this world, and they, who thought that they were the masterminds behind this world, actually didn't know about it until now. Needless to say, there was no need to talk about joy. They were originally helpless, and could only rely on themselves to struggle for a little bit of survival. But now they discovered that there was actually such a great existence in their camp that they could rely on. How could they not be surprised? How should we seize this bit of hope? The creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python said at this time. At this time, it had truly admitted that the old man in front of it, who had obviously lived longer than it had in terms of knowledge and experience, wait. The old man smiled faintly. Wait! The creature that seemed to be a fusion between a wild boar and a python thought of many possible answers, but it did not expect that the answer it received would be this one. After all, logically speaking, if one saw a certain possibility or a certain opportunity, of course one would do their best to expand this possibility and seize this opportunity. Quietly standing here and waiting for an opportunity to arrive should be viewed as a negative attitude, no matter what level and perspective one was from. It should even be used as a counterexample to warn the world. However, at this moment, this existence that he had just acknowledged to be more knowledgeable than him actually made this choice so openly. How could he not be surprised? That's right, wait. How can we fathom such a great existence like the natural enemy? Any of our actions could possibly anger him and cause him to lose his favor towards you. On the contrary, waiting here and doing things according to his arrangements is the most likely choice to maintain his favor, the old man said faintly. Hearing this, the boar-python creature, who was also the leader of the entire alliance, nodded in disbelief, even though he didn't think that this was the best way to go about things. Although it did not think that this was the best method, it did not think of any other method that would be more reliable than this. Therefore, it could only obediently do as it said. At this moment, a creature exclaimed, it arrived so quickly?" This voice attracted the attention of other creatures, causing them to shift their gazes from the old man or the leader to the outside of the abyss, to the direction that had triggered the creature's astonishment. It was none other than a creature with the characteristics of a chaotic creature that was crossing the boundary and charging toward the barren land where the abyss was located. It was so fast that it was astounding. Judging from the looks of it, that creature had already rushed over to this abyss as fast as it could after receiving their guidance. When all the creatures turned their gazes and finally discovered the creature, it had already crossed time and space and arrived above the abyss. This creature had the appearance of the world's connate Taoism aptitude. In other words, it was the appearance of the countless creatures deep in the abyss before they absorbed the chaotic aura. This was the external appearance of being assimilated by the world, and it was also an image that was rejected by the many creatures inside. At this moment, the creature hovered above the abyss, but its heart sank into hesitation. The abyss below looked incomparably strange, as if it contained infinite danger and infinite misfortune. Entering it seemed like an extremely foolish idea. However, from the resonance that he had received, entering the abyss represented a new life, a breakthrough, and liberation. This intuitive understanding conflicted with the information he received in his heart, making him unable to make a decision at the moment. At this moment, the creatures in the abyss below were extremely anxious, and they wanted nothing more than to rush out and pull him down. However, they knew that they absolutely could not do such a thing at this moment. This was because if they did that, the world would instantly discover their existence. Perhaps it would directly transfer the great calamity to the abyss and destroy them. After all, their previous actions had clearly triggered some sort of reaction from the world. The reason why this reaction had not turned into various attacks was only because the abyss was filled with chaotic aura. From a certain perspective, it did not belong to this world. Once they left the abyss and the chaotic aura, the world would definitely be able to immediately connect the various phenomena from before with them. Then, it would transfer countless attacks over and completely wipe them out. As such, although all the creatures were extremely anxious, none of them dared to go out and pull that creature down. Fortunately, since that creature could rush over so quickly, it was obvious that it had already made up its mind. At this time, it only struggled internally for a while before it erased all kinds of distracting thoughts. It made up its mind and rushed straight into the abyss below. In the blink of an eye, it had already crossed the boundary between the abyss and the barbarian land, and disappeared into the boundless darkness. As he entered the darkness, endless chaotic aura wrapped around him and started invading his body. At this moment, the creature felt endless pain radiating from its body. Amidst this pain, his body started to corrode and melt. Soon after, he started to gradually disintegrate. In contrast to this change, his life imprint in the depths of his soul was like dew after a long drought. It started to frantically absorb the chaotic aura and tried its best to fuse this aura into its body. It tried its best to activate and even strengthen the characteristics of the chaos creature imprint that had almost disappeared in its body. The pain of his physical body and the joy and satisfaction emitted by the life imprint intertwined, forming an extremely strange feeling. This caused the creature's expression to become extremely strange. After an unknown period of time, when the creature felt that all the changes had calmed down, its figure had completely changed. From its original appearance of 3 eyes and 4 elbows, it had turned into an image that looked like an ant and a scorpion that had twisted and fused together in an extremely strange way. He has become it. And this incomparably ugly image, at this moment in its heart, was actually so natural, so beautiful, as if this should be his true image, his true body. Chapter 23:48. On this side, the living beings with the mark of chaos were working hard to expand their forces. On the other side, Era of Destruction was in the midst of its greatest crisis. At this moment, he was trying his best to convert the power of the heaven's retribution into his own defensive power, strengthening the space around him to a certain limit. It was about to surpass the limits of the vast thousand world. However, under the endless attacks from the heaven's retribution, it was still on the verge of collapsing. How did it become so powerful all of a sudden? Broken Arrow was still unable to react. Everything was going so smoothly before. He resisted every attack from the heaven's retribution and absorbed the power contained in each attack to strengthen the spacetime he created. He tried his best to improve the spacetime's defensive and offensive capabilities, allowing him to deal with the next wave of attacks with ease. However, he did not expect the heaven's retribution to suddenly change as if it was stimulated by something. The intensity of the attacks was no longer the same as before. Instead, it kept increasing in strength and sublimation. Originally, it would take dozens of waves of attacks to complete, but this time, it was not even comparable to a single attack. After a few more attacks, he was obviously exhausted and could no longer put up an effective resistance. Just like at this moment, although the world around him was vast and powerful, the boundless lightning directly enveloped the world. Countless strange creatures that were far beyond the imagination of this world evolved. Attacks and divine abilities constantly pounced on the world, causing more and more damage to the world. These changes were so unfamiliar to the broken world, but to Luo Fan, who was watching from the void, it couldn't be any more familiar. The thunderbolts gave birth to all kinds of creatures, attacks, and skills that he had created. In other words, this was clearly the space that had plundered everything contained in his fragments and converted them into attacks from the heaven's retribution to deal with broken era. Seeing this, Luo Fan felt helpless and happy. He felt helpless because the heaven's retribution was using him. Although the fragments were shattered by the space, they were still a part of him. Now that the heaven's retribution had dug out everything contained in the fragments, didn't that mean that a part of him had been dug out by the heaven's retribution? How could he not feel helpless? Needless to say, he was overjoyed because the heavenly tribulation would have to go through his fragments in order to use the secrets he had dug out from his fragment. As such, all Duan Shiji needed to do was block the attack and shatter it. That way, he would be able to obtain more fragments that were dozens of times or even hundreds of times more than before. This was naturally something to be happy about. Although it's a little difficult, it's still not a problem. After careful consideration, Luo Fan was relieved. Duan Shiji might suffer a little from this attack and suffer some losses, but he would still be able to block it in the end. As expected, after holding on for a while, the world around Duan Shi's body was torn into countless pieces. His body had also shattered several times. However, in the end, he still managed to block this attack. In the end, he still relied on his final eruption to completely destroy the surrounding boundless thunderbolts, causing the countless fragments that belonged to Luo Fan to finally be completely diluted. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Luo Fan quickly summoned the fragments and fused them into his body, bringing him one step closer to perfection. I'll be truly perfect after another 100 attacks like this. Feeling the improvement of his essence, Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of anticipation. Originally, he might have needed tens of thousands of attacks to reach perfection. However, with the current increase of the heavenly tribulation, he would be able to recover all of his fragments after just 100 more attacks. He would be able to make his fragments in this world complete and reach true perfection. At that moment, Duan Shiji kept praying that the attack would not appear again. He raised his head to look at the sky and the tribulation clouds that looked like black holes. An inexplicable sense of helplessness surged from the bottom of his heart. One should know that his previous world was formed by fusing the power of countless attacks into one spot. However, such a power had been so weak under the previous wave of attack from the heavenly tribulation and had been destroyed so easily. If it were to come a few more times, it would be hard to say whether it would still be able to leave a mark on it. I'll have to say goodbye to my teacher forever if this happens another 3 to 5 times. Duan Shiji thought to himself with a bitter smile on his face. However, despite feeling so powerless, he did not slow down at all. At this moment, he was still trying his best to gather the power that belonged to the heavenly tribulation in his surroundings. He tried his best to gather it around his body to reconstruct his defensive ability. This time, he no longer used the method of the world to construct his divine ability. Instead, he used an extremely pure defensive method to construct his divine ability. After all, although the world was all-encompassing and contained all imaginable and unimaginable powers, it was precisely because it was all-encompassing that it could not reach its limit in any aspect. This was the most suitable choice for him when he was dealing with the heavenly tribulation with ease and had to deal with the myriad of attacks that the heavenly tribulation could produce. However, at this moment, the pressure that he was enduring had almost exceeded his limit. In a situation where he might die if he was careless, this was the most foolish choice. It was precisely because of this that he chose the purest defensive ability to construct his divine ability. As he constructed his divine ability, a layer of light that was as pure as flowing water appeared around his body. It filled a radius of several meters around him, completely isolating his body from the outside world. No power, divine ability, or impact from the outside world could pass through this layer of light and approach him. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the sky began to churn. An unimaginable pressure began to descend from the tribulation cloud. Even if the tribulation clouds were born from the world, the pressure had already exceeded the limit that the world could bear. It caused the space within the tribulation clouds to violently distort. Amidst this distortion, time, space, matter, energy, laws, and everything else seemed to be thrown into an indescribable state of chaos. The chaos was so intense that it even gradually isolated the area from the outside world. It was as if the area had returned to a state of chaos. In the face of such a change, the pure light around Duansher's body began to distort violently as if it was under the greatest pressure. Faint cracks began to appear on the light, as if it was about to shatter. At this moment, Duansher felt an unimaginable fear rising from the bottom of his heart. In a trance, he seemed to have returned to the last moment of his previous life when he stepped into the reincarnation cycle. He once again felt the fear of his body collapsing and being destroyed. What's going on? Is the entire world's energy pouring towards me? At this moment, such an unbelievable thought emerged from the bottom of Duansher's heart. Along with this thought, there was also the most profound despair. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the sky that were like black holes began to distort. Their original pitch-black luster began to dissipate. Various colors that were different from black began to appear in the tribulation clouds. Not long after, the tribulation clouds turned into a human figure. It was an extremely tall and majestic figure that seemed to suppress the void of the universe and the boundless chaos just by standing there. It was a figure that looked extremely similar to the appearance that Luo Fan had turned into in this world. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, could not help but exclaim, 100 times? He could tell that the figure was none other than the condensation of all the energy in the heavenly tribulation. The image that was condensed was completely extracted from his fragment. It was an image that could maximize the power of the fragment. It was his image. The power was more than 100 times stronger than the previous wave of tribulations that Duansher had encountered. In other words, if Duansher could withstand this attack, Luo Fan would no longer need to wait for the other waves of attacks from the heavenly tribulation. All he needed to do was to collect all the fragments contained in this wave of attack. Then, he would be able to retrieve all the fragments that he had previously scattered and regain his full power. However, the premise was that Duansher could withstand this attack. One must know that Duansher had barely managed to withstand the previous wave of attacks. He had even paid a huge price by shattering his body several times in order to withstand the attack. However, this wave of attacks was more than 100 times stronger than the previous wave. The chances of Duansher being able to withstand it were extremely slim. In fact, it was almost impossible. At this moment, even Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of helplessness from the bottom of his heart. What a pity! It seems like there's no way for me to regain my full power this time. The thought appeared in his mind at this moment, causing his expression to gradually turn disappointed. At this moment, Duansher's body and mind were already in shock. He could only raise his head to look at the figure that appeared above him. It was the figure that he was extremely familiar with and admired. Master, he murmured. The despair in his heart had become unprecedentedly strong. One must know that he was confident that he was a dragon among men and the strongest existence in this world. He believed that all living beings and cultivators in this world were no match for him and could not even stand on the same level as him. However, deep down in his heart, he knew very well that he was still too far away from his master. If he was one, then his master would be 100 million, 1 billion, or even 10 billion. No matter how much he had improved, no matter how many times he had grown, compared to his teacher, he was still an insignificant ant. Under such circumstances, he did not have the slightest will to fight when he faced Luo Fan. Originally, he only had admiration, respect, obedience, and worship when he faced the real Luo Fan. However, now that he was facing the Luo Fan that was formed by the heavenly tribulation, the Luo Fan that was his enemy, all he felt was fear and despair. At this moment, the Luo Fan that was formed by the heavenly tribulation's energy began to slowly descend. Step by step, it was as if Duan Shi was getting closer to heaven and earth. With every step that Luo Fan took, Duan Shi felt the pressure on him increase by several times. As for the pure brilliance that was formed by the boundless energy around him, it kept cracking under the pressure. In just 3 steps, the brilliance had completely collapsed. Duan Shi could only face the extremely terrifying pressure that was enough to completely crush heaven and earth. Duan Shi's body was creaking in the face of such pressure. Cracks kept appearing on his body and penetrated deep into the core of his body, into his life source, and even into the depths of his life imprint. As expected of my master. At this moment, Duan Shi was not worried about his life. Instead, he lamented. He knew that Luo Fan was powerful, and he knew that he was just an ant compared to Luo Fan. However, it was only now that he truly felt how powerful Luo Fan was. How terrifying was the gap between him and Luo Fan in the end? I can't even bear Master's aura. What a pity that I can't sit down and listen to Master's lecture like before. As he thought of this, there was an indescribable sense of relief in the depths of his eyes. Although he was about to die and his soul was about to dissipate, there was a sense of relief in his heart. After all, in the final moments of his life, he finally understood just how powerful his teacher was. He understood just how vast and boundless the prospects of cultivation were. To him, this was a rare consolation. At the very least, compared to dying in the heavenly tribulation in a muddle-headed manner, dying in the destructive power, this death made him feel more comforted. At this moment, Luo Fan had unknowingly taken his 9th step. The distance between him and Duan Shi was still extremely far, but the terrifying pressure that was being emitted from his body was something that Duan Shi couldn't bear. At this moment, his body trembled under the terrifying pressure and collapsed in the blink of an eye. Chapter 2349. As the cracks continued to deepen, Duan Shi felt an inexplicable sense of despair gradually emerging from the depths of his heart. This despair was so heavy that it felt as if a boundless world was pressing down on him. It caused the world in his eyes, the world in his senses, and everything in his memories to become dim and lose all meaning. In this despair, a subtle comprehension began to emerge from the depths of his heart. This comprehension started from this despair and continued to spread. The range it affected kept increasing, and in the end, it allowed him to obtain an indescribable sublimation. Under this sublimation, many of the problems he had in the past had all turned into common sense. The fog that had been obscuring his knowledge quickly dissipated. In a trance, he had already broken through an invisible boundary and stepped into a whole new world. This is triggering the essence of my body? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, sighed. At this moment, what happened to Duan Shi was none other than using this despair as a guide to trigger the cultivation achievement that came from his creation template that was contained in the essence of his life. This was a change that seemed to be resonating, but not at the same time. In that instant, Duan Shi's life imprint began to heal rapidly. As his life healed, so did his life origin, spirit, and finally, even his body. Boom! After his body was completely healed, a huge and unparalleled aura was wildly released from his body, colliding with the aura that Luo Fan had transmitted down from above. In an instant, a terrifying shock wave was produced, crazily spreading in all directions. It even cleared up the chaotic time, space, matter, energy, and even the laws of law in the surroundings. Despair. So this is what despair is. Duan Shi muttered at this moment. There seemed to be the deepest despair in the depths of his eyes, but there was also an inexplicable joy. At this moment, He had already understood that he had already broken through the false saint stage and had become a despaired one. It was precisely because he had become a despair one that he was able to slightly resist the aura released by Luo Fan, who was descending from the sky, and was able to struggle a little. However, it was obvious that it was only a little. Soon, as Luo Fan continued to descend from above, the aura emanating from his body became stronger and stronger, and the impact it produced became more and more terrifying. In just a few steps, the shock wave from the clash between Broken Era and the aura was completely suppressed. The pressure even broke through Broken Era's aura and pressed down on him again. However, compared to his previous state where his body would shatter under the pressure of the aura, Duan Shi's performance was much better. The rising power in his body was stimulated involuntarily at this moment. Boundless power continuously rushed towards his body in all directions, colliding with the pressure on his body. Although it was not enough to make the pressure collapse completely, it prevented most of the pressure's effects from reaching his body, allowing him to endure the pressure. He was actually able to block it for a short while. Looks like there's still a chance. At that moment, a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Various methods kept appearing in his mind at this moment, but he rejected them all. If he had enough time, he would definitely spend a lot of time to consider everything clearly, and in the end, he would choose the most perfect method to carry out. However, it was obvious that he did not have enough time at this moment. Even if he used the despair as a catalyst to stimulate the cultivation achievement that he copied from the template and became a despair, Broken Era was still insignificant compared to his fragment that was formed by the heavenly tribulation. It was foreseeable that if he delayed any longer, when the heavenly tribulation formed him arrived before Broken Era, he would not even need to make a move. Just his existence alone would be enough to completely wipe out Broken Era, and even his life imprint would collapse and disappear. With the speed of the figure formed by the heavenly tribulation, it would not take long for that to happen. In the end, Luo Fan secretly gritted his teeth. If I miss this chance, I'll probably have to wait for billions of years to find such a perfect opportunity again. I can only take a risk and give it a try. With that thought in mind, he withdrew all his attention and gathered all his telepathic senses into the depths of his body, into the essence of his life. Through this concentration, everything he sensed began to rapidly enlarge. In the blink of an eye, it had already filled the range of all his senses. Everything related to him also continued to enlarge, becoming clearer and clearer in his heart, becoming more and more obvious. In the end, he relied on the connection of his essence to sense a certain existence outside his body that had a broken connection with him. The moment he sensed the broken connection, he knew that he had found what he was looking for. Immediately, his eyes narrowed, and his power extended along this intermittent connection. Like a plant growing, he did his best to accelerate this connection, causing this originally intermittent connection to gradually stabilize. During this process, he felt an indescribable resistance acting on his power. Under this resistance, every inch his power advanced was like climbing a mountain with great difficulty while facing the endless pressure of the world. Every step seemed to consume his origin and burn himself. In fact, he could even faintly feel that the outside world seemed to produce a subtle tremor with every inch of his power. It was as if the entire world was being shaken by some invisible force. It was precisely because of these various strange feelings that Luo Fan was extremely confident that his choice was correct. Following this connection, he could indeed achieve his goal. However, at the same time, his heart was also gradually raised along with this change. This was because if this guess was correct, it meant that he was about to face an extremely terrifying backlash. It sounded complicated, but in fact, the entire process even surpassed time. When Luo Fan finally completely connected the broken connection and his will descended on the existence that belonged to him through the connection, not even a second had passed in the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan realized that he no longer existed in the cosmic void inside his palace. Instead, he appeared in a place that looked extremely chaotic, as if he was in a state of chaos. At his feet, there was an extremely familiar figure who was looking at him with a complicated gaze. The power surged around his body, as if he had unleashed all his potential to resist the aura that he had unconsciously spread out. That familiar figure was naturally Duan Shi. Duan Shi's current body was condensed by the heavenly tribulation. It had his image, his power, and his might. It was Luo Fan. In other words, the current Luo Fan had basically taken over the heavenly tribulation and replaced it. In an instant, the entire world shook violently. Vaguely, an emotion that was close to anger surged in the void. Endless terrifying pressure rapidly pressed down on the body of Luo Fan that was condensed by the heavenly tribulation. Even the chaos of time, space, matter, energy, and even laws could not withstand it. Under this pressure, they were quickly eliminated and smoothed out. Of course, the elimination and smoothing out of the chaos did not mean that the areas had returned to their original state. Instead, the areas were fixed and maintained the state before they were eliminated and smoothed out. It looked like someone had suddenly pressed the pause button and the original video screen had turned into a photo. I finally succeeded. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, the aura on his body suddenly withdrew. In the blink of an eye, the state that was originally enough to make Duan Shi, who was in despair, collapse physically and mentally, became invisible. Boom power was surging around Duan Shi's body, almost stimulating all of his potential to resist the aura. However, the aura suddenly disappeared completely. The power that suppressed almost all of his potential disappeared completely, causing the power, aura, and potential in his body to instantly rush out of his body. It directly destroyed the surrounding time and space, producing a terrifying impact that spread wildly in all directions. At this moment, the pressure that gathered from all directions was clearly focused on Luo Fan, who was above. Clearly, it did not care about the destruction of the world at all. It allowed Lin Sheng's strength, might, and potential to easily break through it, causing the chaos in the surroundings to be instantly broken apart, revealing a wider and wider region of vacuum. What's going on? At this moment, Duan Shi finally reacted to the change in the situation. He could not help but look around in surprise. In the end, he focused his attention on the power of the heavenly tribulation that had his teacher's image and strength. The moment he saw the figure, he was stunned. This was because he suddenly realized that the original coldness and unfamiliarity of the figure had completely disappeared. It was replaced by calmness and familiarity. Teacher? With the appearance of this feeling, he instantly understood. Wasn't the person in front of him his teacher? It was not a teacher who only had an image, only power, but no will. It was a real teacher. At this moment, his mind became extremely chaotic. He even forgot to retract the enormous power and strength that he had released. He let the power and strength continue to spread in all directions, constantly shaking the space-time that was getting wider and wider. At this moment, most of the world could instantly feel the shocking turbulence that was spreading from this area. Facing such a change, countless living beings were inexplicably shocked. As for the 3,000 cultivators who were the supreme commanders of the entire world in the depths of the space-time, they were even more shocked and frightened. The appearance of the turbulence made them feel that all the worries that they had previously had seemed to be coming true. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a long breath. He looked up at the sky and felt the terrifying pressure that was coming at him from all directions. He felt relaxed. Although such a change was fatal to ordinary cultivators and even Duan Shiji, it was enough to kill them without any chance of survival. However, it was just a small trouble for him. At least, the worst outcome that he had expected did not happen. At this moment, he even had the time to smile at Duan Shi and said, "Why aren't you retracting your power? Do you want to face the calamity yourself?" The words were spoken in a leisurely manner. When they entered Duan Shi's ears, he was awakened from his daze. He was finally certain that the figure in front of him was his teacher. "Thank you, teacher, for taking the risk to save me. If it weren't for you, I would have died a terrible death." At this moment, Duan Shi was enlightened. While he retracted his power and strength, he knelt at Luo Fan and thanked him. Luo Fan smiled and said, "I'm just doing it for myself. What happened here has nothing to do with you anymore. Leave now." Duan Shi hesitated for a moment before he said, I was the one who caused this. How can I just leave and leave the mess to you?" Luo Fan scolded with a smile. "What can you do even if you stay here with your current strength? You're just a burden. I might even need to spare some of my power to protect you. Just go, don't waste my time." Duan Shi blushed when he heard Luo Fan's words. If it was someone else who said that to him, he would naturally refute it no matter what. However, the person who said that was his teacher, the person who could suppress him to the point that he couldn't move with just his aura, and even almost turned him into ashes. For such an existence to give him such an evaluation, what else could he do but accept it? Not to mention, his heart was filled with reverence for Luo Fan. Even if it was an unreasonable evaluation, he would still honestly accept it. Therefore, he could only bow in shame and say, "If that's the case, I'll take my leave. I wish you all the best, teacher." Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. Duan Shi stood up and turned into a ray of light. He dashed toward the tribulations area within a radius of a few 100,000 li. With his speed, he crossed the distance in the blink of an eye and disappeared into the horizon. Fortunately, the heavenly tribulation no longer cared about him. Otherwise, just its aura alone would be enough to turn the boundary of this region into an eternal barrier that could not be broken, completely imprisoning him in this region. Chapter 2350. Faced with this power, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes. Although the current situation was much better than the worst-case scenario, it was still the backlash of the world. Even if it wasn't that bad, it wasn't easy. In that instant, trillions of changes took place in his body. If Duan Shi saw any of these changes, it would be enough for him to comprehend the most profound secrets and even break through the shackles of cultivation, allowing his cultivation to make an unimaginable breakthrough. However, at this moment, such a change occurred in his body in the trillions of times. Amidst all these changes, the might in his body, his power, and his abilities all produced all sorts of mysterious and subtle changes. They naturally combined into various means to counter the countless powers that were attacking his body and directly collided with those powers. For a moment, Luo Fan's body seemed to have suddenly given birth to an infinite spacetime, an infinite heaven and earth, which forcibly swallowed this infinite power. Not even the slightest trace of it was revealed. That kind of intense eruption that should have existed didn't exist at all. It was as if everything had been swallowed up by him. In that instant, the world was enraged. The space-time within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers instantly collapsed. Chaos that was even more terrifying than the battle between Heaven's Retribution and Duan Shi instantly spread out. In the blink of an eye, the place turned into a hazy state of absolute chaos. The pressure that came from all directions and acted on Luo Fan's body instantly skyrocketed by who knew how many times. The thing that caused this area to become so chaotic was obviously this pressure. The terror of this pressure was self-evident. At this moment, Luo Fan even felt as if he had been fixed in the void. Even his body's mobility had been greatly restricted. It felt as if even breathing had consumed a large portion of his strength. At this time, in the face of this terrible situation, Luo Fan's expression became a little more relaxed than before. Specks of spiritual light were released from the depths of his body and continuously seeped into the pressure acting on him. They gradually disintegrated the pressure and allowed his body and mind to regain their original freedom. One must know that although the pressure was terrifyingly powerful and could even directly destroy the surrounding space-time and turn this place into a state of chaos again, it was still pressure in the end. As pressure, it was naturally limited by the essence of power. In other words, it was singular. It wasn't difficult for those who understood its characteristics to bypass this single characteristic. Of course, there was a precondition for this, and that was that the level of the power had to be within the scope of the target's tolerance. If the power exceeded the limit and could even destroy the universe and break the state of chaos, then it would be useless no matter how much the cultivator knew about the characteristics of this power. However, it was clear that the terrifying pressure acting on Luo Fan's body at this time obviously didn't exceed Luo Fan's endurance limit. Therefore, at this moment, he could use the spiritual light that contained his own concept to bypass the pressure and eliminate the effect of the pressure on him. The pressure was the carrier of the world's backlash, so it naturally could not be so simple. At this moment, stimulated by the spiritual light that Luo Fan released, it also produced a corresponding change. In an instant, the great Tao in the dark began to tremble. All sorts of indescribable power was produced from the great Tao and began to penetrate through all sorts of indescribable channels. It quickly rushed towards the spiritual light that dispelled the pressure and collided with the spiritual light, resulting in an earth-shattering reaction. All sorts of indescribable power was born from the point of collision and continued to spread in all directions in the form of shock waves, causing the already chaotic surroundings to become even more chaotic. Vaguely, Luo Fan even felt that the existences that corresponded to him on other planes seemed to be enduring some kind of impact from the outside world. At this moment, they seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Faced with this power that was directly released from the great Tao, Luo Fan knew that he could not delay any longer. The attack this time was already thousands of times stronger than before. It could be predicted that if the situation continued to develop like this, then the next wave of attacks would probably cause quite a bit of trouble for him. After thinking this through, he no longer hesitated and instantly attracted the light of heaven and earth. A mysterious impact instantly erupted from his body and swept across the entire world, causing the entire world to suddenly stop at this moment. It was as if time was completely stuck at this moment, and the entire world was in a fixed state. At this moment, among the living beings in the world, there were those who were extremely sensitive to the world. In other words, they were cultivators who were in a state that was close to being one with the world. However, they suddenly felt a strange feeling that almost overturned their worldview. That was blankness. It was not their own blankness, but the entire world had suddenly become blankness. It was as if something that the world could not understand and imagine had suddenly appeared in front of them, forcing them to understand and imagine it. The source of this change was none other than the power of the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had attracted. After all, the light of heaven and earth was a mysterious light that contained the will of the world. Now that the power of the light of heaven and earth had been attracted, it was naturally impossible for the will of the world to remain still. The appearance of this situation was not because of anything else, but because the will of the world had been interfered with by the will of the world contained in the light of heaven and earth, and had temporarily fallen into a state of chaos. The blankness that the cultivators who were one with the world sensed was the manifestation of this state of chaos. This kind of chaos caused the endless pressure around Luo Fan's body to suddenly pause. This pause did not cause the pressure to disappear, nor did it cause the destructive power that was released from the great Tao that passed through the pressure to disappear. However, it made them all stiffen up. When facing an existence at the level of Luo Fan, being stiff was the most fatal mistake. At this moment, his heart only moved slightly, but he had already seen the tiny flaws in the power and power. Immediately after, boundless spiritual light burst out of his body and turned into countless thin lines that poured into the surrounding pressure. In the blink of an eye, it had already densely covered the chaotic region that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Then, before the will of the world digested the impact of the will of the world contained in the light of heaven and earth and recovered, these spiritual lights flashed wildly. When everything calmed down, Luo Fan's body had already disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. Only the countless spiritual lights that still filled the region that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers were left, enduring the anger of the world and withstanding the impact of the power of the world that had recovered. In the end, it completely collapsed and turned into nothingness, as if it had never existed. I've finally succeeded. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, let out a long sigh. At this moment, there was another Luo Fan in front of him. This was the Luo Fan that he had forcibly taken from the heavenly tribulation and was condensed from the power of the heavenly tribulation. Clearly, Luo Fan had taken advantage of the moment when the will of the world was in a state of chaos to keep this body, avoiding all the detection from the outside world and also avoiding the influence of the power of the heavenly tribulation. Then what are you waiting for? The Luo Fan that was condensed from the power of the heavenly tribulation said faintly. Then, his body gradually began to emit light as if a shocking light source was absorbed into his body. At this moment, it was releasing its own light and heat crazily. This body was condensed from the heavenly tribulation. It looked no different from Luo Fan, but in fact, there were still some differences. In fact, the difference between it and Luo Fan was similar to the difference between Duan Shi and the true sage who could resonate with him. In other words, Luo Fan seemed to be able to completely control this body, and it seemed like he had almost completely turned this body into his clone or incarnation. However, that was only on the surface. In essence, he was still fundamentally different from a clone or incarnation. The reason why Luo Fan was still able to achieve this step and turn this body into a clone and an incarnation despite the difference in essence was actually very simple. That was, he had directly usurped the control of the body through the resonance in essence and completely erased the will that was originally given by the heavenly tribulation in the body. That's right, this resonance was the kind that occurred between Duan Shi and the true sage previously. However, compared to the resonance between Duan Shi and the true sage, the resonance between Luo Fan and the true sage that was condensed from the heaven's retribution was much stronger. Not only was he able to transmit information, but he could also transmit his will, which allowed him to achieve that kind of possession. It was precisely because of the difference between the two that Luo Fan couldn't easily take it back into his body like he did with his clone. Instead, he needed to first disintegrate it, then refine his own fragment. Only then could he complete the process of taking back all the fragment. There was a vast starry sky in the palace that Luo Fan was in. Naturally, there was enough space for him to do whatever he wanted. At this moment, endless light and heat were released from the body of Luo Fan that was condensed from the heavenly tribulation. It gradually melted the surrounding space-time and quickly erased the chaos that was originally caused by Duan Shi, replacing everything in the surroundings with light and heat. In the end, there was a loud rumble, and boundless shock waves erupted, completely shattering the starry sky within the hall. In the blink of an eye, the place seemed to have returned to a state of chaos, and a dusky luster appeared. All matter, all power, and even time and space itself were completely mixed together under the shock waves. However, all these changes did not affect Luo Fan, who was sitting in the middle of the starry sky. At this moment, his expression didn't even change because of this. The impact that could turn the universe back into primal chaos was almost as insignificant as a breeze to him. It didn't even lift the corners of his clothes in the slightest. At this moment, the fragments along with the endless impact surged in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had filled the entire palace, just like the endless stars that originally existed in the starry sky of the universe. These fragments belonged to Luo Fan, and they contained his essence. In the starry sky of the universe that Luo Fan had opened up, they had supreme authority. At this moment, they covered the starry sky of the universe and naturally guided the energy, matter, time, and space in it to continuously gather and mend, forming stars with them as the core. It could be predicted that if Luo Fan did not pay attention to them, they would definitely become the core of the new stars in the starry sky of the universe. In the end, the starry sky would obtain a new order. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had spent so much effort to retrieve these fragments. How could he ignore them at this moment? At this moment, he did not move at all, but his body naturally emitted an unimaginable suction force that accurately locked onto the countless fragments in the chaotic starry sky of the universe. Under the suction force, the fragments began to rapidly shoot towards him from all directions, leaving behind extremely dazzling traces in the boundless chaos. They gathered on his body and rushed straight into his body. As the countless fragments fused with him, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of completion from the bottom of his heart. His cultivation realm also began to rise crazily. In the blink of an eye, he had already surpassed the limit of a first tribulation expert and directly entered the level of a second tribulation expert. Following this, he directly broke through the limit of a second tribulation expert and entered the level of a third tribulation expert. At this moment, this breakthrough gradually slowed down, and finally stopped when he was about to reach the peak of a third tribulation expert. Feeling the satisfaction from the bottom of his heart after breaking through, Luo Fan showed a faint smile on his face. To him, who was currently challenging the sixth tribulation expert, being a third tribulation expert was naturally far from his peak. However, compared to before, his improvement was so great that it had already surpassed the limits of the imagination of all living beings in this world. With such an improvement, many of his previous plans could already be carried out. He was no longer as powerless against this world as before, and could only continue to hide. Chapter 23:51. While Luo Fan was deep in thought, this place that was in between reality and illusion was subtly touched. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that someone was trying to enter this place. He focused his gaze and saw that person in the blink of an eye. It was Duanshu. Of course, in fact, he was the only one who could do it. After all, apart from him, no other existence in this world could find this place, let alone try to enter it. Of course, even Duanshu could only give it a try. Luo Fan was the one who would decide whether he could enter this place or not. At this moment, a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he had already eliminated the obstruction of the existence that existed between reality and illusion. Duanshu felt his vision become empty, and he had already arrived in front of the palace that he yearned for. When he felt the change in the resistance, he let out a sigh of relief. Obviously, this change meant that the owner of this place still existed. It also meant that the worst situation that he was worried about did not happen. At this moment, the door of the hall opened and a mysterious scene began to appear in front of him. It was the process of chaos being split open by a strange, invisible force. The boundless grayness was constantly condensing, dispersing, transforming, and changing in an incomparably natural way. In the end, it gradually turned into a starry sky that was getting clearer and clearer. With Duanshu's eyesight, he could even see that there were lives rapidly being born in the endless stars. All these changes seemed to have transcended time. When Duanshu saw everything clearly, everything seemed to have passed. The interior of the hall had returned to the vast starry sky that he was most familiar with. However, this feeling was completely overturned the moment he stepped into the hall. This was because he suddenly realized that the hall was no longer the same as before. This was an earth-shattering change. The moment he stepped into the hall, an incomparably ancient and vicissitude aura hit him in the face. It made him feel that he did not step into a starry sky that had just been born. On the contrary, he felt like he had stepped into an ancient place that had billions of years of history and had gone through countless tribulations. Just this moment alone made him understand that the foundation of this starry sky in front of him had already been fundamentally improved compared to the last time he saw it. As expected of teacher, even when facing the heavens and earth, he's still able to obtain a lot of benefits. Duan Shi lamented. With this thought in mind, he had already arrived before Luo Fan, who was at the center of the universe. Although the universe was vast and boundless with a radius of hundreds of millions of light years, for Duanshi, who had already surpassed the false saint stage, it was clearly not much different from an ordinary hall. He only needed 1 or 2 steps to cross the distance of hundreds of millions of light years and directly arrive at the center of the universe. When he saw Luo Fan, all the distracting thoughts from before disappeared in an instant, replaced by boundless gratitude and joy. He couldn't help but kneel down and feel deeply grateful to Luo Fan. Obviously, Luo Fan didn't care about Duan Shi's gratitude. He just said, "This matter is also of great benefit to me. You don't have to worry about it. No matter what teacher's plan is, your kindness to me is real. I won't dare to ignore it," Duan Shi said with extreme determination. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally couldn't be bothered to say anything more. He just said, "Let's not talk about him for now. Let's talk about your problem now. You felt it too, right? Just now, at the last moment of the tribulation, you already felt him, right?" Duan Shi's expression suddenly changed when he heard this. He said, "Teacher, are you talking about the existence that I came into contact with in despair?" As expected, I still can't get rid of him in the end. Luo Fan sighed. Actually, Luo Fan still had some feelings for Duan Shi in front of him. After all, he wasn't cold-hearted. Even if his temperament was perfect, it didn't mean that he didn't have any emotions. It was impossible for him to not care about someone who respected him so much that even at the last moment of his life, he didn't want to serve him in front of him anymore. Due to these feelings, he couldn't completely ignore Duan Shi's experience. He couldn't just sit back and watch Duan Shi fall into the fate that he hated the most. "What is that? Teacher, please teach me." Duan Shi hurriedly bowed down and shouted. Although in the end, he had relied on the despair to stimulate his potential and become a hopeless person, only then was he able to struggle out of the heavenly tribulation and survive. That kind of breakthrough and the benefits were too strange for him. It was so strange that he couldn't help but recall his experience in his past life. He recalled the true saint who seemed to be able to resonate with him. At this moment, when Luo Fan mentioned it, he began to worry. He was worried that he would fall into the tragedy of his past life again. Luo Fan smiled and said, "Don't worry too much. Although it's a little dangerous, it's not inevitable. Your current situation is fundamentally different from before." Duan Shi let out a sigh of relief when he heard that. However, he still couldn't relax completely. After all, although he trusted Luo Fan and understood that Luo Fan said that it was different from before, it must be different. However, Luo Fan hadn't fully explained what was going on. Moreover, judging from his words, it wasn't that there was no problem, but it wasn't a big problem. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This heaven and earth isn't the real heaven and earth. It's just a replica." Duan Shi's mind was instantly shaken to the point where he almost collapsed like a bolt of lightning. He was instantly dumbfounded. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Although Luo Fan had revealed some information to him in his past life, it was obvious that Duan Shi had completely forgotten about it. At this moment, when he heard this, he felt that it was no different from someone who had not received any information at all. At this moment, he wanted to deny it. However, his trust in Luo Fan eventually won him over, so he directly eliminated the thought of denying it. Just like that, his expression kept changing. After a while, he gradually came back to his senses and said, "I've lost my composure. Please forgive me, Master. I'm a little disappointed that you trust me so much." Luo Fan sighed. If he had no feelings for Duan Shi, the more blind Duan Shi was to him, the happier he would be. However, since he had some feelings for Duan Shi, even if it wasn't deep, he felt inexplicably disappointed to be so blind to Duan Shi. After all, blindness was the biggest enemy of a cultivator's cultivation. blindness towards any existence, even blind trust towards a true sage, was a fatal weakness. That was because blindness represented dependence. Dependence represented a lack of confidence in oneself. Without confidence, it meant that one would never have the chance to become a true saint. Becoming a true saint meant that one would replace the perfect heaven and earth with everything he had. What kind of unbelievable feat was that? Without a heaven-defying belief and an incomparably firm self, how could one succeed? Without confidence, it was obvious that one's self was not firm enough, and one's belief was not firm enough. Of course, it was impossible for one to succeed. Hearing this, Duan-Shi could not help but blush. He said, "I've let you down, master." Looking at his reaction, Luo Fan naturally knew that he had no intention of changing his mind. He could only smile bitterly to himself. "You'll have to pay attention to this matter in the future. It won't be good to change it by force." That was all he said to Duan-Shi at that moment. After that, he changed the topic and said, "Since you already believe that this heaven and earth is some kind of clone, it's easy to deal with it. Since even the heaven and earth are clones, everything in this heaven and earth naturally has a template." When Duan-Shi came back to his senses, his expression changed abruptly. At that moment, he finally understood what Luo Fan was trying to say. If everything in this heaven and earth had a template, then what about him? "Disciple's template," he said in shock. "That's right. Your template is the true saint who can always resonate with you," Luo Fan said. Hearing this, Duan-Shi was slightly stunned. However, compared to his previous life, he had made great progress. This time, he did not completely break down and die like in his previous life. Instead, his soul was shaken and his realm was slightly unstable. Regarding this, Luo Fan did not forcefully suppress his aura and maintain his realm. Instead, he waited quietly for his aura to naturally stabilize. As he waited, his emotions gradually calmed down. Being injured was not a big deal to someone at Duan-Shi's level. No matter how serious the injury was, as long as he still had his consciousness, he would definitely be able to find a way to solve it. Even if he could not think of a way, there was still Luo Fan. Since he had such confidence, he naturally did not care how serious the injury would be. As long as Duan-Shi's soul did not break down and he did not die, it was fine. After a while, Duan-Shi gradually calmed down. At this time, the aura on his body had weakened by many times. It felt as if he had fallen to a state between a false saint and a person in despair. However, at least his realm did not completely drop. "Not bad, you've finally made progress. In your previous life, you had a mental breakdown after hearing this news and reincarnated," Luo Fan said to Duan-Shi. Hearing the praise, Duan-Shi smiled bitterly and said, "Although I'm still alive, I'm only left with half of my life. Since you're so open-minded, I believe you don't need me to tell you what's the self and what's the truth. The information you received at the last moment of the heaven's tribulation was to stimulate the remaining potential in the template that you copied from the true saint. To a certain extent, this kind of potential isn't a bad thing. As long as your path of cultivation is the same as the true saint and there's no difference," Luo Fan said calmly. Hearing this, Duan-Shi nodded. As for what Luo Fan was talking about, what was self and what was truth, he had naturally experienced a struggle. After all, no matter what, he was still an existence above the false saint stage. Such an existence could generate billions of thoughts and ideas in an instant. It could be said that in that instant, he had already considered his entire life over and over again for an unknown number of times. Naturally, he had already thought clearly about the problem of his self and his truth. What he cared about was what Luo Fan said, the extremely vast potential hidden in the depths of his life that pushed him to break through at the last moment of the heaven's tribulation. Although he had only come into contact with that kind of potential, he was already shocked. One must know that he had only come into contact with it slightly before, and he had already made such a huge improvement. If he could fully stimulate this potential in the end, how terrifying would the improvement be? However, whether it was his own feelings or Luo Fan's attitude, it showed that this kind of potential was not a good thing for him. If he really accepted this kind of potential without reservation, he would probably regret it in the end, which was why he could not fully accept this kind of potential. At this moment, after hearing Luo Fan's words, he finally understood the hidden dangers of this potential. If I really accept this potential without reservation, I'm afraid that I'll gradually become an existence that's no different from that true saint. In the end, I might obtain supreme divine powers and rise to an unimaginable level. However, that might no longer be me, but some kind of incarnation of that true saint. At that moment, he broke out in cold sweat and felt as if he had just brushed shoulders with death. Thank you for your guidance, Master. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I wouldn't even know that I've fallen into the trap. Duan Shi immediately thanked Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, You've now implemented your initial self and slightly separated yourself from your own destiny. In the future, you have to stick to it. Don't be greedy for a moment of pleasure that will lead to regret in the future. Yes, Master, Duan Shi quickly said. Luo Fan nodded and immediately stopped talking about this topic. Instead, he began to guide Duan Shi on his cultivation. With Luo Fan's careful guidance, Duan Shi felt that an extremely vast world had opened up in front of him. His cultivation realm began to rise bit by bit in the process. In a trance, he had already crossed the bottleneck between the false saint stage and the desperation stage, and entered the desperation stage again. Moreover, compared to before, he was 30% stronger this time. His control of this realm was completely incomparable to before. Chapter 23:52. Luo Fan looked at the harmonious aura emitted from Duan Shi's body from above and was secretly gratified. Although the realm that Duan Shi obtained from the heavens tribulation was not directly imparted to him, it was still something that came from a kind of resonance. Under such circumstances, the true saint's influence must be extremely great. Compared to Duan Shi's own cultivation path, there was a slight difference. Such a difference would have a huge impact on one's cultivation path. It would determine whether Duan Shi would develop into an alternative incarnation of the true saint or become an independent cultivator. The reason why Luo Fan spent so much effort to let Duan Shi's realm regress and re-enter the new realm was to make up for the difference. He wanted Duan Shi to re-enter the despaired realm with his own cultivation path. He wanted to truly obtain the cultivation path of the despaired realm that belonged solely to him. Obviously, Duan Shi's current performance had met Luo Fan's expectations. You've just broken through. You should stabilize your realm first. You don't have to worry about anything that happens in heaven and earth, Luo Fan said to Duan Shi. Duan Shi was slightly stunned when he heard that. He knew that Luo Fan was being considerate of him, so he quickly responded. Then, Luo Fan did not stay any longer. He waved his hand and asked Duan Shi to leave. He then went to open up a dojo to cultivate. In the past, he asked Duan Shi to stay here to cultivate because Duan Shi's strength was not strong enough. If he left, he might accidentally fall into the influence of the true saint's traces again. Now that Duan Shi could walk between heaven and earth for so many years without being affected, and he had even walked out of his own cultivation path, there was no need for him to worry about it anymore. Duan Shi naturally could not reject Luo Fan's request. After bowing to Luo Fan, he turned around and left the hall. After leaving the hall, he was naturally expelled from the place that was in between reality and illusion. He returned to the normal heaven and earth. After returning to this place, he didn't hesitate and directly entered the depths of space-time. He pushed aside the layers of laws and opened up a palace in the void between the layers of laws and the unseen laws and laws. This hall looked much simpler and smaller than Luo Fan's hall. However, it was also extremely mysterious, possessing an incomparably powerful presence in the void. It stood there like a world of its own, giving off a feeling that it encompassed everything. Duan Shi could not help but feel slightly disappointed after the palace was opened up. Compared to his own teacher's hall, this hall was still far too inferior. If it was opened by his teacher, the palace would be at least 10,000 times more profound than this. Of course, this feeling did not linger in his heart for too long. After all, it was only natural that he couldn't compare to his teacher. If he could, he would be extremely surprised. Immediately, he entered the palace and began the longest cultivation session since he was born. After Duan Shi left, Luo Fan did not stay in his hall for a moment. After sensing the outside world for a while, he discovered that the outside world had completely returned to normal. He could not help but smile faintly. In a flash, he disappeared from the palace and directly appeared in the outside world. After arriving here, the whole world faintly trembled. However, the trembling was extremely weak and lasted for a very short time. It almost made people think that it was just an illusion. Feeling such a movement, Luo Fan knew in his heart that his previous conjecture had been confirmed. As expected, after he collected all the fragments from the outside world, the world could no longer easily lock onto him, although he had expected it. When he confirmed it, Luo Fan still felt a little relieved. He could not help but shake his head and laugh. In the end, he could not help but feel lucky. However, he did not reject this kind of wishful thinking. Instead, he carefully savored the various feelings brought about by this kind of thinking. After all, it had been a very long time since he had felt such ordinary emotions. As he savored the various emotions, he leisurely walked around the world. He was currently a third tribulation powerhouse. At this stage, even Duan Shi, the strongest powerhouse in the world apart from him, was not worthy of a glance from him. As a result, as long as he didn't want others to notice him and didn't want to cause any changes, then no cultivator or change in the world would be able to notice his existence, nor would they be affected by him. Therefore, even though he spent a few years traveling to every inch of the world, even going to the headquarters of the alliance formed by 3,000 cultivators, strolling around the palace that was built when Duan Shi was still a great emperor, and staying in the deep abyss of the southwestern wildlands for a few months, not a single living being discovered his existence. Not a single living being felt that something was wrong because of this. For all living beings, the situation in the world was extremely normal over the past few years. Even if there were occasional conflicts and chaos, it seemed to be the result of the natural evolution of the rules of the world. They had no idea how many things Luo Fan had done in the world over the past few years. That's right, Luo Fan did not just stroll around casually over the past few years. Over the past few years, he had prepared hundreds of millions of special arrangements for the world. Some of these arrangements were to help the world resist the tribulations, while some were to help the impending tribulations destroy the world, the two aspects intertwined, forming a structure that was like a seesaw. It made the situation in the world inexplicably strange, like a bucket of explosives that could ignite at any time and a bucket of water that was only separated by a thin film that could be broken with a poke. It could be predicted that with all these preparations, if the world encountered a tribulation, the duration of the tribulation and the way it would develop would probably depend on a single thought from Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan did not pay much attention to these arrangements. In other words, he didn't have much hope for the results he could achieve from these arrangements. He had set up these arrangements mostly to test the world, to test the various tribulations of the world, and even the final great tribulation of the world. After all, although he had stepped into the world for a long time, he had already been affected by the laws of the world from the very beginning. He had been forced to hide in the place that existed between reality and illusion. The various guesses, knowledge, and senses he had about the world were actually obtained through various indirect methods. He still did not have much understanding of the world. This time, it was not easy for him to walk freely in the world again. Naturally, he would not let go of such a good opportunity to increase his understanding of the world and the tribulations. Several years later, after Luo Fan finished setting up everything, he did not return to the place that existed between reality and illusion. Instead, he chose an extremely ordinary spot in the world and settled down. He pretended to be the most ordinary cultivator in the world and obediently completed the various cultivation tasks of a cultivator. In secret, he was constantly receiving feedback from the various arrangements he had set up in the world. Through the various results of the feedback, he deduced the truth of the world that he did not understand when he was in the place that existed between reality and illusion. Of course, because the tribulation had not yet arrived, he did not know much about the other thing that he wanted to understand, which was the tribulation. However, he was not anxious about this, as he already had enough time. After all, the tribulation would come in the end. Time slowly passed, and soon another tribulation descended. This time, the tribulation began in the abyss in the depths of the barren land in the southwest. On this day, a living being in the abyss suddenly had a sudden impulse and developed an extremely strong desire to destroy. This desire to destroy could not be suppressed at all. Even the Alliance Master, who was like the fusion of a wild boar and a python, could not calm him down at all. Just when everyone was at a loss, the creature let out an explosive roar and crushed a creature beside it. Then it charged into the sky with boundless ruthlessness and charged out of the abyss, starting to announce its existence to the entire world. Damn it! The Alliance Master was shocked and furious. Compared to other living beings, his mind was clearer and he was more intelligent. At this moment, he had already thought of many things and vaguely understood what was going on. At this moment, the extremely ancient old man, who was also the old man who said that the Alliance Master was favored by his natural enemy, let out a sigh. Time's up. I wonder how many of us will survive this time. As he sighed, his body began to slowly sink into the abyss, slowly approaching the boundary between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. At this moment, the Alliance Master noticed his actions and could not help but yell angrily, "Stop! Are you going to sit back and do nothing again? What can I do?" The old man looked up at the Alliance Master and met his incomparably resentful gaze. His eyes were still clear, without a trace of guilt or hesitation. There was only a matter-of-fact expression. "You have more experience than all of us. This is such a precious asset. Are you not going to contribute your strength?" The Alliance Master said angrily. If it was not for the fact that the old man was unfathomable, he would have already pounced forward and used his strength to express his thoughts. In a tribulation, experience is the most useless thing. If you believe in experience, then experience might kill you. Aren't you already clear about this? The old man continued to sink as he said so. At this moment, the other living beings finally reacted to what the Alliance Master and the old man were talking about. In an instant, their expressions changed drastically. Some of them were even affected by the shock in their minds, and the violence that they suppressed began to expand wildly. In the end, they directly erupted with power, severely injuring their companions, or rushing out of the abyss with the first living being. Seeing this, the Alliance Master was even more shocked and furious. Think about it carefully. Did you think that the favor of your natural enemy would only slightly develop your wisdom? After saying that, the old man's figure completely disappeared into the darkness, completely disappearing from the senses of all living beings. At this moment, the Alliance Master was stunned. "The favor of my natural enemy," he muttered, his emotions in a mess. The short period of time before he became the Alliance Master resurfaced in the depths of his memory and began to unfold in his heart bit by bit. It was as if he had experienced that period of time again and recalled everything from back then. In a daze, he felt as if there was endless information emerging from the depths of his heart like his own inspiration. The information was so complicated and mysterious. From this information, he seemed to understand many things but also seemed to understand nothing. After a while, when it came back to its senses, it discovered that many things that it couldn't see clearly before suddenly became very clear at this moment. The fog that had been covering it seemed to have completely dissipated at this moment. The tribulation, which was originally an extremely mysterious existence to him, actually became obvious at a glance. I see, I actually overlooked so many things before, he muttered with an indescribable sense of helplessness in his eyes. Amidst this helplessness, there was also a hint of confidence that should not have appeared. It was as if he had already tightly grasped the throat of fate during that short period of time when he was in a daze. This change in attitude instantly calmed the many living beings who had the mark of chaos creatures. No matter how it came about, their leader was confident enough to deal with the upcoming disaster. This was something that was extremely reassuring. The tribulation this time has begun again. This is a huge disaster for us, but it is also a huge opportunity, the Alliance Master said at this moment. His voice was extremely confident and loud. At this moment, even the most cowardly living beings could not help but be encouraged by this voice and naturally gave birth to a faint hope. What opportunity? We don't see any opportunity. What we see is only a disaster. Some living beings mustered up the courage to refute. Chapter 23:53. Don't be blinded by the world, the Alliance Master said calmly. The Alliance Master said faintly. His expression contained a profoundness that other living beings could not understand. It was as if he was standing at a much higher position than all the other living beings, and the world he saw seemed to be completely different from the world they were looking at. Have we been blinded by the world? The living beings murmured. They seemed to have come into contact with some secrets that had always been there, but they had always ignored them. It also seemed like there was nothing, as if everything was just an illusion. This feeling made these creatures feel inexplicably irritated. Among them, some of the living beings were triggered by this irritation. The ruthlessness that had been suppressed in the depths of their hearts for a long time caused them to lose their rationality and charge out of the abyss, causing the number of living beings in the abyss to decrease once again. However, at this moment, neither the Alliance Master nor the other living beings were in the mood to pay attention to them. To the Alliance Master and these living beings, the living beings that could not withstand the ruthless impact did not have the right to be their companions. If they left now, it would save them trouble. Seeing that the living beings were deep in thought, the Alliance Master said calmly, "Don't forget how we appeared. Are we really alone and helpless? Do we really not have any backing?" Hearing this, all the living beings' hearts lit up. Their eyes lit up as they came to a sudden realization. It was as if a brand new world had opened up before them. That's right, we came from the primal chaos. The reason we appeared in the first place was because of the world's tribulation. Our backing can't be compared to the world at all. A living being roared furiously. Its voice was filled with fervor and excitement. At this moment, the imprint that came from the primal chaos creature in its body suddenly began to shine with a chaotic light. The light even seeped out of its body, causing it to seem like it was covered in a layer of gray mist. It seemed so mysterious and profound. Following this change, the creature's body began to undergo an indescribable change. It seemed to be increasingly incompatible with the world, but it was increasingly compatible with the primal chaos aura that was being emitted from the depths of the abyss below. It was becoming increasingly harmonious. This change made all the living beings in the surroundings turn to look at it. It must be known that there were quite a few living beings that had instantly comprehended this, but this living being was the only one who had truly experienced this change. Seeing this, many living beings knew at a glance that this being was not simple. It's probably a very important individual in this tribulation. More and more living beings had the same thought, including the Alliance Master. One must know that the reason why the Alliance Master was able to think of all that just now was because of the countless mysterious information that appeared out of nowhere in the depths of its heart. It was the product of the countless mysterious changes that the so-called natural enemy had instilled into it. At most, it only meant that it was special in the eyes of its so-called natural enemy, but it didn't mean that it was special among the many creatures with chaos imprints. In fact, the truly special and important ones among the creatures that bore the mark of chaos, at least in comparison to this particular calamity, was the massive number of creatures hidden in the depths of the abyss. At this moment, the creature in front of him was producing changes that other creatures couldn't produce. This clearly proved that it was the creature that the Alliance Master was looking for. As expected, my guess was correct. At this moment, the Alliance Master murmured and looked at the creature that was shrouded in gray mist with a complicated gaze. The creature didn't care about the gazes of the other living beings at all. At this moment, it was extremely pleased with the feeling of having the mark of chaos imprint strengthened. At this moment, it had a strong feeling that it only needed to tremble slightly to destroy the world. Everything that it had been worried about previously seemed so insignificant at this moment. In fact, even the Alliance Master that it originally revered so much, the natural enemy that it felt was supreme and could change the fate of all living beings with just a little favor, was no longer noble and could no longer stand above it. In this state of mind, it slowly opened its eyes and calmly looked at all the living beings in the abyss. At this moment, there was a completely unconcealable disdain and contempt in its eyes. It's a pity that although you have such a perfect foundation, you've still been assimilated by the world too much. As it said that, the power in its body began to swell. Massive and unparalleled power swept across the entire abyss in an instant. It began to shake the abyss, causing it to gradually break away from the pitch-black darkness and turn into something similar to primal chaos. It was completely filled with a gray existence. Along with this change, all the living beings in the abyss felt an indescribable, complicated feeling surge up their bodies. This feeling was between pain and comfort. If it had to be described in one sentence, it would be pain and happiness. What was comfortable was their bodies and the mark of chaos imprint. As the gray existence enveloped their bodies, it constantly invaded their bodies and continuously changed their bodies. Subsequently, it changed their life marks, causing their bodies and life marks to be constantly enhanced and sublimated. This clearly made them feel extremely pleased and comfortable. However, at the same time, this grayish existence also carried an incomparably powerful will, containing an unimaginable pressure. This will and this pressure constantly impacted their star souls and their self-awareness. During this process, they constantly felt that their souls were shouldering a heavy burden of billions of tons. It was as if they were stepping towards the abyss of collapse at every moment. They were moving towards collapse and destruction at every moment. This feeling naturally made them feel incomparable pain. At this moment, the living being that changed the environment of the abyss seemed to become extremely impatient. It roared, "What are you resisting for? Don't you want to return to your original selves and reclaim the endless power from long ago?" Along with this roar, the gray existence that was released from its body began to become more violent and powerful. Puffed, 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 puffed. As light sounds rang out, the hundreds of living beings could not withstand this sudden increase in pressure. Under this pressure, their bodies and minds trembled violently. In the blink of an eye, they collapsed and reconstructed. Following this collapse and reconstruction, they seemed to have changed their minds and became extremely similar to the living being that was releasing the endless gray mist at this moment. Seeing this, the living being glanced at the other living beings in disdain and said, "Stubborn fools." Then, it couldn't be bothered with the other living beings anymore. It didn't seem to make any movements, but with a shake of its body, the endless gray mist began to roll back and finally converge back into its body, restoring the abyss to its previous darkness. The living beings that had their bodies and minds collapsed and reconstructed looked at the living beings that were still struggling pitifully at this moment, as if they had missed out on an important opportunity. "There's no longer a share of this opportunity for all of you," the being shrouded in gray mist said to the Alliance Master and the others. As he spoke, he called out to the hundreds of living beings that had just been converted and soared into the sky, charging straight out of the abyss. The instant they charged out of the abyss, their auras began to swell wildly. A boundless and terrifying aura of destruction began to spread endlessly across the world. It was like a huge dark cloud that enveloped the entire world, causing the entire world to sink into the shadow of destruction. Kill. Destroy. Everything in this world is ours. A roar filled with incomparable killing intent spread across the world. Furious roars filled with boundless ruthlessness erupted from all over the world. The terrifying and violent aura was simply like a plague. In the blink of an eye, it had completely changed the atmosphere of the entire world. "They seem to be pitying us." A living being in the abyss sighed. Looking at its appearance, it was extremely incredulous. "This is normal. After all, from their point of view, we have lost the opportunity to regain our original strength and essence. Naturally, we are worthy of pity." The Alliance leader let out a long breath and said. The other living beings looked at each other and saw a sense of absurdity and lingering fear in each other's eyes. What was absurd was that those living beings had clearly lost their sense of self and were completely controlled by chaos. They had become puppet-like existences. Yet, they actually thought that this was a great opportunity and that this change was a perfect change. How could they not feel that this was absurd? As for the lingering fear, it went without saying that those living beings were no different from them in the past. Yet, after being converted, their thoughts actually underwent such a huge change. Didn't this mean that if they experienced what they experienced, they would also experience the same change? In other words, they were only a step away from having their thoughts completely converted and losing their sense of self. How could they not be afraid? Fortunately, that's what they thought. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let us off so easily. The Alliance leader said with a relaxed expression. His words made the other living beings relax. Indeed, if those living beings didn't have such a mentality and didn't think that the transformation was a kind of kindness to them, they would be quite stingy with it and wouldn't be willing to persist for a longer period of time. Otherwise, most of them would have fallen into the same situation as those living beings. But is this the opportunity that the Alliance leader mentioned? No matter how I look at it, this is a disaster, right? A living being questioned the Alliance leader. Isn't this an opportunity? Don't you realize that you're different from before? The Alliance leader said plainly. Hearing this, the living being was slightly stunned. Then, its eyes brightened. It suddenly realized that both its body and mind had made considerable progress. Its strength had also increased by at least 10 times. This kind of change would have taken millions of years to complete. But now, in just a few breaths' time, it had already obtained it. If this wasn't an opportunity, what was? We passed the test, but they didn't. It's just that simple, the Alliance leader said after seeing the change in the emotions of the living beings. At this moment, an old man slowly floated up from below. He looked at the changes in the living beings with a hint of surprise in his eyes. There are so many of them left. It seems like the tribulation this time isn't that great. This old man was naturally the old man who dove down to hide when the tribulation was born. Why are you here? Aren't you going to continue hiding down there? A living being asked unhappily. It was obvious that they were extremely dissatisfied with the old man's decisive action of retreating and dodging. If it wasn't for the fact that the old man still seemed unfathomable, and they still couldn't see through him even after so much improvement, they might have already pounced on him and taught him a lesson. The old man glanced at it plainly and said, "Don't you feel it? For us, this tribulation is over. As long as we stay here, we won't be affected by the tribulation anymore." Apart from the Alliance leader, All the living beings were stunned when they heard that. Following that, they used their own methods to sense and calculate. The final conclusion they obtained told them that what the old man said was indeed the truth. The violent impulse in their hearts that constantly urged them to leave this abyss and destroy this world had completely disappeared. Everything seemed to have returned to how it was before the tribulation, as if the horrors from before had never happened. This was clearly a sign that they'd overcome this tribulation. How is this possible? It hasn't even been 2 hours. Some of the living beings murmured. They felt that the situation had overturned their understanding. They felt that the world had become so unfamiliar, and everything had become so incomprehensible. One must know that normally, a tribulation of such a large scale that affected the entire world would only last for a period of time that could be calculated in years. If it was on a larger scale, it would not be an exaggeration to say that thousands of years had passed. However, it hadn't even been 2 hours since they sensed the tribulation. It could even be calculated in a breath's time, so how could the tribulation have passed? Since when are tribulations related to time? The old man only said that and did not say anything else. He continued to hide in a corner like before, as if he was spacing out or cultivating. Chapter 23:54. This shift in attention was clearly caused by the old man's own presence gradually weakening. A sense of existence was closely related to attention. Although the essence of these creatures was not weak, and their current strength was quite powerful, their development was still a little biased. They were still too weak in this aspect that had nothing to do with battle, so the influence they received was much greater than ordinary cultivators. That was why this happened. The old man only weakened his sense of existence, and they naturally shifted their gazes. Compared to the other creatures, the Alliance Master had received some guidance from Luofan, so he was able to see a lot more things. However, at this moment, he did not shift his gaze at all and continued to stare at the old man. The old man only smiled faintly at the Alliance Master's gaze and did not intend to speak at all. The Alliance Chief's heart became even more cautious when he saw this scene. His wariness towards this old man became even more intense than before. However, it was clear that this was not the time to dwell on this. He immediately said to the other living beings, "That's right. To us, the tribulation has passed. From today onwards, we'll be safe until the next tribulation arrives." Why is this happening? Normal tribulations shouldn't be this fast. Could it be that the tribulation this time is very special? A living being asked this question. The Alliance Master only shook his head when he heard this. Of course not. This tribulation is actually very normal. In fact, compared to the previous few, this tribulation might be the most severe. It's just that through the changes that happened earlier, we've already transcended the tribulation and are no longer controlled by it. Right now, the outside world is still in the midst of a tribulation, and there are still countless disasters happening. Hearing this, the living beings completely understood what was going on. So that was the case. They relied on the changes that happened earlier to graft their own tribulations. In other words, they grafted their tribulations onto the living beings that charged out of the abyss earlier. By grafting their tribulations onto the lake region, they naturally would not encounter any more tribulations. As for the living beings that had their tribulations grafted onto them, it would be difficult for them to survive the tribulation. For a moment, the living beings' emotions became complicated for some reason. It was naturally something to be happy about to be able to escape the tribulation. However, this method of escaping the heavenly tribulation was to graft the heavenly tribulation onto someone else. Seriously speaking, it was no more than a form of escape. In a certain aspect, it caused them to feel defeated. Amidst these complicated emotions, the abyss once again fell into silence. At this moment, the entire world above the abyss had already fallen into an extremely chaotic state. There was destruction everywhere, killing everywhere, wailing everywhere, and angry roars everywhere. In the depths of the void, The palace where the 3,000 cultivators were located was activated at full force at this moment. The various powers, divine abilities, powers and formations that they had set up all over the world were gradually activated. At the same time, the number of living beings who had lost their minds and only knew how to destroy and destroy continued to increase, and they began to slaughter all living beings. The battle turned white-hot in the blink of an eye. In just a few days, 20% of the living beings had died. The newly born living beings in the past tens of thousands of years were naturally confused about this, and they felt despair as if the end of the world had arrived. However, to those living beings who had participated in the last calamity from tens of thousands of years ago, this was an extremely familiar nightmare that had descended upon them once more. At the same time that they felt pain and despair, they also used the fastest and most effective methods to resist. It was precisely because of the resistance from the many experienced living beings that the death rate was so low. Otherwise, if it weren't for them, how could only 20% of the living beings have died in the face of such a tribulation? Perhaps even 20% was a small number. As the world fell into this tribulation, Luo Fan had been staying in his place of seclusion, quietly observing all the battles, destruction, and disasters that happened in the world. Countless living beings were struggling, fighting, and fighting. There were also countless living beings crying, roaring, and dying. There was also an endless power that contained the mark of destruction that was constantly being unleashed, everything gathered into an extremely tragic scene that contained all the beauty and ugliness. It was reflected in Luo Fan's eyes bit by bit. However, all of this did not leave too many ripples in his heart. It was not that he was cold-hearted and did not have any compassion. It was because his cultivation had allowed him to completely see through the essence of life, so his view of life and death was completely different from that of mortals. For mortals, death was turning everything into nothingness, and it was the complete loss of everything they had. However, for him, even if his soul was destroyed, there would still be a mark left behind, and it would only take a single reincarnation for the world to be reborn. Not to mention that the life of an ordinary living being, even if it was not an ordinary living being, but a cultivator who had already started cultivating and obtained a relatively long lifespan, was so short in his eyes. Even if they did not die a violent death, they would only live for a blink of an eye in his eyes. Did they want him to give them compassion for the sake of a blink of an eye? How could it be so easy? It was precisely because of this that he could calmly watch the birth of the tribulation at this moment. It was also why he could so easily watch the tribulation wreak havoc and destroy living beings in the past. Time passed bit by bit. To the living beings in the abyss, the tribulation ended in less than 2 hours. However, to the living beings in the outside world, the tribulation lasted for more than 300 years. Over 300 years later, when the being that charged out of the abyss and was shrouded in a gray mist of primal chaos finally collapsed under the combined efforts of thousands of cultivators, this shocking tribulation finally came to an end. In order to overcome this tribulation, the entire world had paid a heavy price. Thousands of valleys were carved out of the central continent, and large areas were completely shattered, causing the central continent to shrink by a lot. As for the living beings, almost 80% of them had perished, causing this entire expanse of the heavens and the earth to seem much more spacious when compared to before the calamity. Of the 3,000 cultivators who were the leaders of the world, nearly 2,000 died, leaving only 1,000 or so cultivators who stood at the peak of the world, controlling the order of the world and preventing it from collapsing due to the tribulation. I didn't expect to have so many companions. Looks like we're getting more and more experienced. The peak quasi-sage looked at the hall that was 2/3 empty and sighed. Hearing this, the other cultivators smiled bitterly, and their eyes were filled with exhaustion. Next, the most important thing is to choose companions from the surviving cultivators to join us and maintain the size of our 3,000 people, the peak quasi-sage said to the crowd after a long while. Hearing this, the cultivators were slightly excited. Now that this tribulation had passed, the next thing to do was to repair the world and recuperate. The most important thing was to prepare for the next tribulation. In order to prepare for the next tribulation, they had to replenish the number of 3,000 people as soon as possible. After all, they had already gotten used to the number of 3,000 people in the past few tribulations. Moreover, most of the preparations for the previous tribulations were for the 3,000 people. If they did not replenish the number of 3,000 people, it would be equivalent to giving up on the powerful cultivators who had survived the previous tribulations. Therefore, even if everyone was extremely exhausted, even if the entire world was in a state of desolation, replenishing the number of 3,000 cultivators was still the first thing they had to do. Of course, this was from a public point of view. Privately, replenishing the number of 3,000 cultivators was also extremely important to the remaining 1,000 or so cultivators. After all, new cultivators needed to be recommended, and these new cultivators would naturally be close to the cultivators who recommended them. After joining, it would naturally be equivalent to strengthening their own faction. Therefore, after hearing the peak quasi-sage suggestion, everyone forced themselves to be spirited and began to recommend cultivators one by one. Having experienced this a few times, they naturally formed a perfect rule at this time. However, there was nothing much to say. After a series of arguments, calculations, and compromises, the list of nearly 2,000 cultivators was decided. Then, it was time for the cultivators to contact the cultivators they had recommended. The entire world gradually fell into a state of bustle. In just a few days, the number of 3,000 cultivators was replenished. The newly joined cultivators were naturally extremely honored to be able to join the highest decision-making hall. Even the sadness brought about by the previous tribulations was slightly alleviated. As expected, they have recovered. Seeing the change in the atmosphere in the hall, the peak quasi-sage was inwardly delighted. At the same time, he also felt a little helpless. The change in the atmosphere was not due to the recovery of the world, but due to the change in the authority. From a certain perspective, this was something worthy of sorrow. It was not difficult for the highest decision-making hall to restore the world after the tribulations. In fact, they had already gained some experience in this field. After the number of 3,000 cultivators was replenished, all sorts of orders and arrangements were soon issued from the hall. The entire world began to rebuild after the tribulations in an extremely orderly and efficient manner. Living beings began to be born at an unimaginable speed. The various damages caused by the war began to be repaired by all sorts of remarkable abilities, formations, and powers that could be found all over the world. In just a few thousand years, the entire world had been restored to its original state before the tribulations. At the very least, in terms of vitality, the atmosphere of the world, and the number of living beings, it had been restored to its original state before the tribulations. As for the standard of the cultivation world, the upper echelons were slightly stronger than before the tribulations. However, the lower echelons were extremely different from before the tribulations. The reason for this was obvious at a glance. At the upper echelons, many powerful cultivators had survived the tribulations. These cultivators had comprehended many things that they could not comprehend in the past due to the trials of the tribulations. As a result, their realms and strength had been greatly improved. At the lower echelons, because almost all the weak cultivators had perished in the tribulations, the remaining cultivators had grown up in the past thousands of years. In comparison, there were much fewer and weaker cultivators than the cultivators who had grown up in the past tens of thousands of years before the tribulations. At this point, the 3,000 cultivators of the highest decision-making hall finally heaved a sigh of relief. They slightly relaxed their control over the world, allowing the world to slowly regain its freedom. After all, the control was only temporary. With their careful guidance, The cultivators in the world could advance on the most correct path that they knew, but their knowledge was still limited. Compared to the natural evolution of the world, they were still lacking. It was naturally not a problem to control and guide the world after the tribulations. However, if they continued like this without letting go, it would obviously stifle the potential of all living beings. In reality, they had controlled the world like this for thousands of years, which was actually quite a long time. Normally speaking, if it was a normal tribulations, they would not interfere at all. They would allow the world's own power to repair the various damages in the tribulations and complete the rebirth of life. That was the most perfect way to bring out the potential of all living beings. However, there was nothing they could do. The two tribulations might only be separated by tens of thousands of years. If they allowed the world to recover on its own, it might not be able to completely restore the world to its original state even after tens of thousands of years. At that time, when the tribulations descended, the world's ability to resist would become even weaker, and the damage it would suffer would be even greater. Perhaps it would not be strange for all living beings to perish if they were not careful. It was precisely because of such a special situation that the 3,000 cultivators had no choice but to interfere and control the entire world. They did their best to bypass all the detours and rebuild the world. Whether it was during the tribulations or the reconstruction after the tribulations, Luo Fan had always lived in seclusion. He did not leave, nor did he participate. No matter how the tribulations developed, and no matter how the reconstruction after the tribulations were in full swing, his place of seclusion was not affected at all. It had always maintained its original appearance, as if time had completely stopped here. On this day, Luo Fan, who was casually sitting cross-legged and adjusting his breathing, suddenly felt something in his heart. He abruptly opened his eyes and looked into the distance. It was because he felt that a certain preparation he had made before he walked the world had changed, as if it had been touched by something. Chapter 23:55. The location of the triggered preparations was a seaport on the eastern border of the central continent. When Luo Fan walked past this place, he had only casually made some preparations for the eruption of the tribulation. In other words, through the changes of various powers, he had constructed something that was similar to a divine ability that resonated with the tribulation. This thing was usually extremely stable, but once a tribulation of a similar nature descended, it would be triggered by the aura of the tribulation, and it would be instantly activated, erupting with earth-shattering power that could greatly strengthen the power of the tribulation. It would even be enough to turn the space within millions of miles around this harbor into powder. The danger of such an existence was self-evident. However, its stability was also self-evident. After all, during the previous tribulation, even though this world was almost destroyed, and more than 80% of living beings had died, it was still not activated. It was still quietly lying in this place, as if it was completely harmless and was just some ordinary thing that was naturally born in this world. However, at this moment, the situation clearly did not meet the conditions that Luo Fan had set, and yet it had already been activated. How could he not be surprised? The strength of Luo Fan's perception naturally went without saying. Just by spreading his perception, he had already clearly seen the entire harbor, from top to bottom, inside to outside. After the harbor was rebuilt, although it was much more spacious than before the tribulation, it could be considered to have recovered its liveliness. At this moment, in a certain residence in the harbor, a child was dumbfounded as he looked at a fist-sized stone that he had picked up floating in the air and emitting a mysterious light. The fist-sized stone looked extremely ordinary at first glance, as if it was an extremely ordinary stone that could be seen everywhere on the ground. However, at this moment, the mysterious light that was being emitted from it made it impossible for anyone to associate it with the word ordinary. The stone seemed to contain endless profundities and endless secrets. Facing such a stone, an indescribable fanaticism flashed in the depths of the seemingly ordinary child's eyes. Although he was constantly retreating, his heart was filled with desire. This child was also an extremely ordinary-looking child. It was as if he could be seen everywhere in this world. If he had appeared somewhere else, even Luo Fan would not have paid attention to him. However, at this time, he actually appeared here, and even used some strange method to trigger the divine ability that Luo Fan had originally left in this position, which was prepared for that tribulation. This obviously made him completely isolated from ordinary people. There seems to be the aura of some sort of tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception swept across this location, and in the blink of an eye, he completely saw through most of the child's secret. He had a vague guess in his heart. The child seemed ordinary, but there was an extremely obscure aura hidden in the depths of his life imprint. It was an aura that Luo Fan had never sensed from any other living beings in this world. It was the aura of a tribulation. The aura was so deep and obscure that if it was not for the fact that it was searching for Luo Fan, even the most powerful person in this world, Duanshi, might not have sensed the existence of the aura. The aura that belonged to a tribulation was completely different from the living beings with the imprints of chaotic creatures. Although the living beings with the imprints of chaotic creatures were considered to be the ones who triggered tribulation after tribulation in this world, they were still ordinary living beings. The reason why they triggered tribulation after tribulation was because they were not tolerated by this world. In other words, it was because this world was against them. It was not because these living beings were intrinsically related to the tribulation. However, it was obvious that the little boy in front of him was different. The child had nothing to do with chaotic creatures at all. He was indeed a living being that was born and raised in this world. Not only his body, but even his life imprint was the same. However, in the depths of his life imprint, there was the aura of a certain tribulation. It felt like he was the embodiment of that tribulation. This situation was extremely unbelievable. If it was an ordinary cultivator, even if Duanshi was here, he would not be able to understand how this happened. However, what kind of existence was Luo Fan? This situation that seemed completely incomprehensible to him only took a slight thought in his heart. As various thoughts flashed through his mind, he had already roughly guessed the truth. So that's how it is. Just like how Duanshi is the counterpart of the true divine in the perfect world, I'm afraid this person is also the counterpart of the tribulation in the perfect world. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan's heart moved. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had crossed an infinite distance and arrived at the harbor. He appeared in an extremely ordinary house and stood in front of the child. The child was looking at the glowing stone with inexplicable enthusiasm, as if it was brewing some kind of earth-shattering upheaval. All of a sudden, his vision darkened, and he found a figure appearing between him and the stone, completely blocking his view. He could not help but exclaim in surprise. He took a few steps back and accidentally fell to the ground. He shouted, "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" As he shouted, a trace of panic flashed through the depths of his eyes. He could not help but look at the stone that was floating in midair behind Luo Fan that was emitting endless brilliance. It was obvious that he was afraid that Luo Fan was here to snatch the stone. Luo Fan understood his mentality at a glance. At this time, he just smiled and said, "Don't worry. Since you can activate it, it is naturally yours. I will not snatch your opportunity." As he spoke, he gently waved his hand. The stone suddenly flashed and appeared in his hand. At the same time, the countless brilliance radiating from the stone began to quickly converge. In the blink of an eye, it had completely turned into the appearance of an ordinary stone. It looked no different from when the child first found it. The child was both delighted and astonished. He wanted to come up and grab the stone, but he was afraid that Luo Fan was lying to him. For a moment, he seemed extremely hesitant. Looking at his reaction, Luo Fan could not help but smile. He gently sent the stone over and the stone appeared in front of the child, floating quietly. At this time, Luo Fan said to the child, "The power of this thing is quite strong. If it really erupts completely, I am afraid that the entire harbor will be completely wiped out. Before you learn how to control it, it is best that you do not activate it again." Although the child was only 10 years old, his mind was quite mature. At this moment, a doubtful expression appeared on his face. He said, "You are not lying to me, right? Why would I lie to you? Do you think you have anything that is worth lying to me?" Luo Fan could not help but laugh. The child thought about it and accepted this explanation. Then, he said, "What is this thing? If it is so dangerous, then I don't want it." This thing did not have a name before, but since you obtained it, you can call it the Tribulation Pearl. Take it. Others may not be able to control it, but there will not be a problem for you. Just remember to control yourself in the future and not let the desire to destroy in your heart. Only then did the child raise his hand to grab the stone. As soon as he grabbed the stone, he felt that it was different from before. Previously, the stone felt like a volcano that could explode at any time. When he held it, he felt like he was going to be drowned and destroyed by it. However, at this moment, he only felt a sense of harmony, as if he had already become a part of the stone, or rather, the stone had become a part of him. With a slight thought, an indescribable wave was emitted from the stone. As the fluctuations spread out, the entire residence had already undergone earth-shattering changes. From its original simple and crude appearance, it became dazzling with golden light. Everything seemed to be made of gold, and it looked incomparably extravagant. This change caused the child to cry out in surprise, and he almost threw the stone in his hand away. This was because this change was clearly the thought that appeared in his mind for a moment. As he cried out in surprise, another wave swept past, and the surrounding gold had completely returned to its original appearance. The house looked no different from before. "Have fun." Luo Fan looked at him and smiled slightly. His figure slowly dissipated along with his tiny figure, and in the blink of an eye, he had completely disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared here. Faced with this change, the child showed a panicked expression and shouted, "Don't go! I still don't know who you are." However, his cry did not change Luo Fan's actions at all. He had still left in the house, only the child was left alone. Looking at the extremely familiar and empty house, the child suddenly felt an indescribable sense of panic. The treasure in his hand that could almost make his wishes come true suddenly became a little hot. Suddenly, he thought of something and mumbled, "Make my wishes come true?" Following this change, his eyes lit up. Then, he held the stone tightly and kept thinking in his heart, "Come back quickly, come back quickly." Wave after wave of waves began to spread from the stone in all directions as he thought of this. Gradually, they went deep into the void and spread to an endless distance. However, that was all there was to it. This time, things did not go as smoothly as the renovation of the house. The waves spread for a long time, but there was no feedback. The figure that he wanted to find did not appear at all. After waiting for a long time, when Luo Fan did not appear, the child put the stone aside in disappointment. "It seems that you are not omnipotent." Then, he lay on the bed in disappointment and fell into a deep sleep. Fell asleep? His reaction made Luo Fan, who was watching him, feel that it was ridiculous. Normal living beings would be so excited that they would not be able to sleep after obtaining such a powerful treasure. However, this child actually directly threw the stone away and fell asleep on his own without any concealment or protection. He did not know whether to say that the child was careless or simple-minded. However, although he felt that the child's behavior was quite inappropriate, he had no intention of interfering. He allowed the child to casually throw the stone away, and he began to shift his attention away from the child. After all, although the child's life imprint contained the aura of a tribulation, it was ultimately just a manifestation of a tribulation. Even with the help of the item that the child left behind, he was not a match for the world. His existence could only cause some trouble for the world at most. It was clearly far from enough for him to cause enough damage to the world. After shifting his attention, Luo Fan did not return to his place of seclusion and continue to enjoy his peaceful life. Instead, he began to search the world. His target was none other than the existence that had the same characteristics as the child. The tribulations in this world were endless, with one wave after another. If one wave of tribulations could exist in the world in the form of a manifestation, there would naturally be other tribulations in the same form. If he could find those living beings, although he would not be able to overturn this world, it would be enough for Luo Fan to gain a deeper understanding of the relationship between the tribulations and the world. It was naturally impossible for him to gain too much of an advantage because of this. However, it was enough for him to have some new ideas, and he might have some new choices. Things clearly would not go so smoothly. Whether a living being was the manifestation of a certain tribulation or not could only be determined by a certain aura hidden in the deepest part of the life imprint. Under such circumstances, if there were only a few living beings, it would naturally be a simple matter for Luo Fan to determine if they were among them. However, what he had to distinguish now was not just a few limited living beings, but an almost infinite number of living beings. Who knew how many trillions of living beings? With so many living beings, it went without saying how difficult it was to dig out the life imprints in their bodies one by one and identify the aura in the deepest part of the imprint. Even with Luo Fan's abilities, it was clearly not easy for him to achieve this step. In fact, if it were not for Luo Fan, even Duan Shi, who was the strongest powerhouse in this world apart from Luo Fan, would not have been able to achieve this step. On this side, Luo Fan was slowly looking for the incarnation of the calamity. On the other side, after the child fell asleep, the stone slowly floated up and landed on the child's body. It emitted a faint light and began to wash the child's body. Chapter 2356. This child was originally just an ordinary creature in this harbor. He could not even be considered a warrior. As an orphan, he was able to survive in this harbor completely by relying on his little cleverness and the pity of other people in this harbor. But now, under the scouring of this light, he was breaking away from the mortal world at an unimaginable speed and ascending to the itinerant immortal realm in just one night. He had broken through the boundary between immortal and mortal and become an itinerant immortal. The entire process was so natural that it didn't seem forced at all, and there wasn't even the slightest trace of strange aura leaking out. It was even to the extent that none of the living beings in the harbor knew that a bodiless immortal had appeared in the harbor. An itinerant immortal, who was already extremely powerful among the mortals. The moment before the child woke up, the light emitted by the stone completely vanished. As the light vanished, so did the light emitted by the child. Apart from the stone floating above the child's body, nothing else could be seen in the room. Then, the stone sank slightly, and in the blink of an eye, it sank into the child's chest like a shadow, completely fusing with it as if it didn't exist at all. At this moment, the child suddenly woke up with a start. He leaped up and floated in the air, looking around blankly. After becoming an itinerant immortal, the perspective of a mortal was naturally completely different. Even if the stone's improvement to him was incomparably natural, and even if he himself already had such strength and such a realm, he could not change the fact that this perspective was the first time he had come into contact with it. At this moment, this was the first time he felt so high and mighty, and all the secrets were exposed to him without any concealment. The child was at a loss. After a while, he adapted a little, and began to look around for the stone that could resonate with him. His perception swept out. Not just this room, but all the details of the entire harbor were instantly included in his perception. However, within the range of his perception, there was not the existence of that stone. It was as if the existence of that stone was nothing more than a dream of his. How can this be? Where did it go? Was it really just a dream? If I'm dreaming, How could I have obtained this kind of power? The child was instantly at a loss. At this moment, a powerful aura rushed into the sky from somewhere in the harbor, violently colliding with the perception the child had sent out. The child instantly felt pain in his head, as if a huge hammer had smashed into his head. This pain came so suddenly that he couldn't react at all. He couldn't help but let out a blood-curdling scream. "What did you do to Ergo?" At this moment, an angry roar entered the child's ears. This child was an orphan. Because his parents died early, he didn't even have a proper name. He was just casually called Ergo. The Ergo that the roar was referring to was obviously him. "I'm Ergo." Ergo was confused. He didn't understand why the other party would say that he had been treated badly when he was clearly here. Just then, there was a loud bang. The entire house was blown to pieces, and a powerful force was sent toward the Dark Dragon Hound along with the debris. The Dark Dragon Hound was at a loss in the face of such an attack. Although he had obtained the power and realm perfectly, this kind of power that ordinary creatures couldn't resist was actually not very strong for him. However, he was only a mortal after all. Even if he had fought with other living beings, it was only at the level of a mortal's brawl. Under such circumstances, how could he know how to deal with this sudden attack that came directly at him? For a moment, he could only instinctively raise his hands to cover his head, just like what he did when he was bullied by hooligans in the past. A powerful force directly hit the Dark Dragon Hound's body. An indescribable pain came from his body, making him feel as if his body had been completely torn apart. He couldn't help but let out a blood-curdling scream. As he screamed, his body was forcibly penetrated into the ground below, and he quickly rushed into the depths of the ground. Ah! The blood-curdling screams kept coming from the cave, echoing in the harbor like thunder. At this moment the attacker was revealed. It was a middle-aged cultivator with the strength of an itinerant immortal. The cultivator looked puzzled. "What's going on? Why did I succeed so easily? Who is this person? Why does he look like he has no combat experience at all?" This cultivator was a cultivator who lived in seclusion in the harbor. To him, the harbor was actually his territory. Although he didn't have deep feelings for any of the residents in the harbor, he was extremely familiar with them. Even the orphan Dark Dragon Hound was the same. This familiarity, coupled with the fact that he treated the harbor as his territory, made him deeply detest any cultivator who used tricks in the harbor without notifying him. To him, the change in Dark Dragon Hound's body meant that some cultivator had directly taken over his body without his permission. Clearly, this was a violation of his rules. At this moment, an indescribable sense of danger surged in the middle-aged itinerant immortal's heart. Sensing this sudden sense of danger, the middle-aged itinerant immortal turned pale with fright. He instinctively activated the magic artifact he had refined, forming a brilliance that enveloped his body. However, at this moment, he felt an indescribable pain erupt from the depths of his body. The pain was so intense that he even completely lost his sense of power, his soul, and his magic artifact. Then, with a loud rumble, his entire body exploded brazenly, forming a mushroom cloud that soared into the sky. In the blink of an eye, he was completely blown to pieces by some invisible force. Just now, the middle-aged itinerant immortal's sudden attack had already shocked the residents in the entire harbor, causing a large number of gazes to gather in his direction. Now, such a powerful existence that could make everyone in the harbor feel suffocated had actually exploded in the sudden change, turning into dust and scattering smoke. This instantly caused the minds of the residents in the entire harbor to go blank. What's going on? After a long time, such doubts surfaced in their minds. For a moment, they felt that their understanding of this world had been completely overturned. This harbor was originally so ordinary that there weren't even many warriors here. How did such a powerful immortal suddenly appear? And then this immortal was turned into dust and scattered smoke by some incomprehensible attack. disappearing without a trace. This sudden change made it impossible for them to react for a moment. At this moment, the ground kept shaking, as if some huge existence was constantly shaking the entire harbor from underground. This change instantly dispelled the doubts in the hearts of the many residents in the harbor. Compared to their doubts about the reason for the middle-aged itinerant immortal's appearance and death, their own lives were still more important. For a moment, the entire harbor fell into chaos. The residents ran everywhere, trying their best to avoid the collapsing buildings, looking for a chance to survive. However, their efforts were quite futile. The tremors generated from the depths of the earth didn't weaken with the passage of time. Instead, they grew stronger with the passage of time. At first, it was just like an earthquake, but soon, it was as if the heavens and earth were flipping, as if a large hand was grabbing the entire harbor and shaking it crazily. Blood-curdling screams could be heard from every corner of the harbor. Along with the screams, there were all kinds of indescribably strange sounds, like the sound of flesh being flattened and smashed. This process lasted for dozens of breaths. Then, an incomparably dazzling light burst out from underground, and a terrifying power was released, directly enveloping the entire harbor. The screams became more and more tragic and louder. But soon, everything disappeared completely. Apart from the sound of the impact of the power, there was no other sound. When the light disappeared and the power calmed down, there was only a large empty pit left in this area. The port, which was originally quite lively and had tens of thousands of residents, had completely disappeared. The seawater outside the harbor began to pour into the deep pit, gradually filling it up. It was as if the harbor had never existed, and all the traces left behind by the harbor were completely covered. From then on, the continent would forever be missing such a small opening. After a long time, a whirlpool gradually formed on the surface of the sea. Then, a figure rushed out of the sea and floated in midair, looking around blankly. This figure was, of course, Ergo. However, compared to before, the current him had risen by another level. He was no longer an itinerant immortal, but a perfected immortal. At the very least, he was equivalent to a perfected immortal. Where is this? Why am I here? Who moved me here? He murmured, feeling inexplicably lost. Obviously, he had almost completely forgotten everything that had happened before. Perhaps it wasn't that he had forgotten, but he simply didn't want to remember. For a 10-year-old child, to completely destroy his hometown, all the people he knew, all the people who had treated him well, and all the people who had treated him well, was obviously a very heavy memory. He looked around, but in the end, he still couldn't figure out why he was in the sea. In the end, he could only scratch his head and slowly fly toward the land in the distance. Although it was his first time using this flying ability, it wasn't difficult for him at all. His flying posture was also quite natural, as if he was walking on the ground normally. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was searching the land in his seclusion, couldn't help but sigh. Is this a coincidence or a necessity? Although he was searching the land and looking for the incarnations of other tribulations, he didn't completely block off Ergo's location. The changes that happened here were so intense that he naturally sensed it. He could clearly see things that even the people involved couldn't figure out. After Ergo was smashed into the ground, the middle-aged itinerant immortal's power did not stop destroying him. Instead, it kept invading his body and destroying it. At first, Ergo's body clearly couldn't withstand the destruction at all, and it kept crumbling under the power. But soon enough, the stone that had fused with his heart started to show its might. Intense light was released from the stone, and it directly swept away the power that was destroying his body. Later on, because the power was too powerful, Ergo's cultivation base had a huge breakthrough. He had just broken through to the itinerant immortal stage, but he brazenly skipped several stages and became a perfected immortal. However, although the power was released by the stone in an instant, it was still too powerful, and Ergo couldn't completely absorb it with such a small breakthrough. After pushing Ergo into the perfected immortal stage, there was still a large amount of the power left, and it continued to rush out. The middle-aged itinerant immortal was the first to suffer. Under the impact of the power, he couldn't even block it for a moment, and he was directly shattered by the power. The next one to suffer would be the harbor. In the blink of an eye, all the buildings, residents, and even the topography of the entire port were completely erased by this force. It was as if the port had never existed in this world, and the entire continent seemed to be missing a small piece of it. Ergo didn't feel anything that happened. This was because he had already fainted the moment the power erupted, because he couldn't withstand the impact. He only regained his senses when the power completely disappeared and the surroundings returned to normal. He instinctively broke free from the obstruction of the land and seawater, rushed out of the sea, and appeared in midair. Chapter 23:57. After the dark dragon hound left the ruins of the harbor, it was a magnificent adventure. Although this world had just recovered from the damage caused by the tribulations, it was still an extremely complete world after all, and the standard of the cultivation world here was definitely not low. In such a world, the number of experts was naturally not small. How could this seaport not attract the attention of other cultivators when it was suddenly erased? Once cultivators noticed Ergo, who had the strength of a true immortal, but appeared extremely immature, and his control over his power was extremely crude, he would naturally be very conspicuous. Which cultivator who could cultivate to a realm above the true immortal realm had not gone through countless trials and tribulations? How many of them were truly foolish? Under such circumstances, the dark dragon hound situation was naturally discovered after a short test. Once it was discovered that Ergo's cultivation realm had been improved by some treasure, the outcome was obvious. Naturally, there would be all sorts of competition, schemes, deceptions, and roping. Although Ergo was extremely mature among mortals of the same age, he was still too immature in the eyes of true cultivators, and was naturally at a disadvantage. In the beginning, he was easily toyed with by almost any cultivator. His own strength had been studied countless times. It could be said that if it weren't for the cultivators dragging each other down, he might have been completely devoured in the first few months. However, it was exactly because of this that Hound had the chance to grow. He was able to stimulate his potential time and time again, as well as the power of the stone that had fused with his heart. As a result, he was able to avert danger time and time again, and he was able to improve time and time again. In the end, in just a few short years, he had grown into a colossus, and became an expert that could suppress an entire region. Moreover, his cultivation realm had unknowingly grown to the connate Grand Luo realm. His experiences in the past few years could be said to be the experiences of a main character in the legends. It was so legendary and coincidental that even those who saw it for themselves wouldn't dare to believe what they saw. However, it wasn't without a price. After going through so many legendary experiences, Ergo's heart was already riddled with holes. In just a few short years, he had seen the sinister nature of the human heart, which was something that other cultivators couldn't see in thousands or tens of thousands of years. This kind of knowledge caused him to unknowingly lose confidence in this world. He also gradually lost his original closeness to all living beings. The law of the jungle, where the strong preyed on the weak, had been deeply engraved in his heart. He was like a firecracker that would explode at the slightest touch, becoming extremely dangerous. A cultivator at the connate golden immortal realm was considered to be a pretty strong expert in this world. One should know that even the strongest of the 3,000 cultivators in the highest hall was only at the peak of the quasi-sage realm. Apart from the peak-level sage-to-be, there were even some who had just entered the sage-to-be stage. Even the 3,000 cultivators with the highest status were only at this level, so it was self-evident how high the status of a connate golden immortal realm cultivator was. Such strength allowed him to become an overlord of this world. He occupied a corner of this world in an extremely unyielding manner, stood towering above all living beings, and achieved success and fame, while Ergo was experiencing all sorts of legends that only protagonists could experience. Luo Fan had been working hard to find other incarnations of tribulations for the past few years. The number of living beings in this world was just too much. Even if it was just a cursory search, it would still take a lot of time. Now, after a few years, he had only checked almost 1/10,000th of the living beings in this world. In other words, if he continued at this speed, he might need tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands of years to check all the living beings in this world. After all, apart from cultivators who had become immortals, ordinary living beings had a limited lifespan. They would die, and they would also be reborn. After tens of thousands of years, the number of living beings in this world would probably change countless times. Therefore, it would naturally take more time than simply accumulating time in order to be able to investigate all the living beings in the area. If it was an ordinary cultivator, they would definitely be impatient with such a task, and might even give up after estimating how long it would take. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was not an ordinary cultivator. For Luo Fan, there was no difference between 1,000,000,000,000,000 years and an instant. Even if the task lasted for 1,000,000,000,000,000 years, it would only feel like an instant to him. In this way, as long as time allowed, not to mention tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, even tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, or even billions of years, he would not feel any impatience. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly had a thought, and a faint smile appeared on his face. I actually found one in just a few years. Looks like the number of incarnations of tribulations is much greater than I imagined. The thought flashed through his mind. As he thought of this, he focused his senses. In an instant, he had already looked through the creature that had triggered him from top to bottom. The living being was an old man. It was an extremely old man who looked to be over 100 years old. He was also a mortal creature, and his strength was much weaker than Ergo's back then. At this moment, Luo Fan could sense the aura of a tribulation coming from the depths of the old man's life imprint. The aura was different from the one emitted by Long Hound's life imprint, but it was very similar in nature. It was obvious that he was also an incarnation of a tribulation. Furthermore, he was not an incarnation of the same type of tribulation as Long Hound, but an incarnation of another type of tribulation. Luo Fan was not surprised that the incarnation of the tribulation was not a child or a young man, but an old man. After all, who knew how many times such incarnations had reincarnated in this world? Who knew how long they had lived before this? How could they be in the same generation? It was only normal for there to be both young and old. After discovering the old man, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. An item similar to a god's ability that he had prepared for the heavenly tribulation traversed time and space in an extremely natural manner and appeared near the old man. The item was similar to a god's ability, and it was a method that Luo Fan had prepared for the tribulation that resonated with the aura of the tribulation coming from the old man's life imprint. Originally, it would only be activated when the tribulation descended. However, when the item arrived near the old man, it suddenly became active, as if some sort of power was awakening from its slumber. It gradually began to emit all sorts of indescribable fluctuations. The fluctuations connected with the aura coming from the depths of the old man's life imprint, causing the aura to become active as well. As the aura became active, the old man instinctively sensed that something closely related to him was calling out to him from the direction of the item. For a time, the old man, who had been served by his children and grandchildren at home for decades, finally had the thought of leaving home for the first time. As an extremely old man with a house full of children and grandchildren, all the rules in this world no longer had any restrictions on him. Even if his children and grandchildren tried their best to stop him out of fear that something would happen to him, they could not stop him from making a decision. In the end, He was allowed to stagger out of his home and arrive at the item that Luo Fan had transferred to him a few kilometers away from home. The item was also a stone. However, compared to the stone that Dark Dragon Hound had obtained, this stone was smaller and more ordinary. The moment the old man saw the stone, his heart pounded wildly. A strong desire told him that this was the treasure that he had been searching for his entire life. He immediately bent down with great difficulty and picked up the stone himself. As soon as the stone touched his hand, a buzzing sound came from it. Immediately after, an intense light burst out from the depths of the stone, causing the extremely ordinary stone to suddenly turn into a ball of flames. The light spread up along the old man's palm, and in the blink of an eye, it had already covered his entire body, completely enveloping him. For a time, the children and grandchildren that came out with the old man turned pale with fright. All sorts of screams, panic, and even wails could be heard. "Put out the fire!" Furious roars came from afar. It was the children and grandchildren who had been secretly guarding the place with some strength. They finally couldn't help but show themselves and roar. At this moment, the light had completely engulfed the old man, making it impossible for the people around to see him clearly. Crack, 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 crack. All sorts of strange cracking sounds came from the light, and it felt like something was constantly shattering inside. The horrifying sounds made the children and grandchildren even more panicked and anxious. However, it was clearly not up to them to decide. In that light, all of their efforts were in vain. Their bodies that charged toward the light were pushed away, and the power that they sent out was easily erased. Even the methods that they used to put out the fire were completely repelled. Although some of them had mastered some extraordinary powers, they were only at the level of ordinary warriors. In the face of such a strange light, they were all helpless. In the end, they could only watch as the light enveloped their ancestor and heard all sorts of horrifying sounds coming from it. Deep down, they could only make all sorts of guesses that made their bodies tremble at the thought of it. After dozens of breaths, the light gradually faded. The scene that appeared in front of them directly overturned the three views of the children and grandchildren. "What's going on? Where did the ancestor go? Who are you?" A young man in his 20s roared, and threw a punch at the figure that appeared after the light faded. However, after the light disappeared, the person that appeared was not the old man, but a young man who looked like he was only 17 or 18 years old. The young man was obviously a little confused at this moment. When he saw the fist coming toward him, he instinctively took action and grabbed the fist. With a slight force, the young man's face turned green, and his entire body fell to the ground, screaming continuously. "Are you trying to deceive your master and destroy your ancestor?" Just as the others were about to make a move, the young man spoke. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he was slightly taken aback as he realized that there was something strange about his voice. When the others heard this, their bodies trembled, and they looked at the young man with a look of disbelief. Although there was a change in his voice, the tone was clearly the tone of their ancestor. This made them have an absurd thought. Could it be that this person in front of them was their ancestor? With this thought, no one dared to move. If this was their ancestor, then this matter was worthy of a surprise. At this moment, the young man began to feel his body, and a smile gradually appeared on his face. In the end, the smile turned into laughter. "Youth. This is youth. I've finally regained my youth. Ha 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 ha." Those who had not aged would not know how much an old man desired to regain his youth. Although the old man in front of him did not know how all of this had happened, nor did he know what price he had to pay for it to happen, as long as he had regained his youth, everything would be worth it. As he laughed, the aura on his body surged and began to spread out in all directions without holding back. It began to gradually distort the space around him, causing his descendants to have no choice but to continuously retreat, making more and more space for him. It really is him. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was extremely far away, had this thought flash through his mind, and a faint smile appeared on his face. as he smiled, the perception he had gathered on the old man gradually retracted. He no longer paid any attention to what the incarnation of the tribulation would do next. He didn't have a specific plan for awakening these incarnations. He just wanted to throw them into the furnace of the world and see what changes they could bring to the world. As for what they should do, what they would encounter, and whether they would be of help to the world in the end or destroy it, it did not matter to him. Therefore, when he saw that the old man had already obtained the power he had prepared, he naturally didn't have the mood to care about what the old man would do next. Naturally, the old man did not know any of this.